Tonight, we're diving into the entire story of Voldemort, from an unloved orphan in London to the darkest wizard of the age. This is a fascinating topic, but I'll keep my narration calm to ensure you can still drift off to sleep. Thank you to those of you who've been joining us consistently. If you're falling asleep with us tonight, let me know in the comments how many nights in a row you've been here. And if this is your first night, just comment night 1. Now, back to the video. Picture London in the dying weeks of 1926, a city wrapped in the low hush of winter fog, its street lamps haloed in amber against a sky the color of wet slate. Somewhere beyond the reach of Muggle maps that mattered to wizards, and yet entirely within the ordinary world, a narrow lane called Wol's Court cut between brick walls, stained black with soot. Snow had not yet fallen that December, but the air carried the particular cold that precedes it, a damp chill that settled into stone and bone alike. At the end of the lane stood a tall, plain building with narrow windows and a door that had been repainted so many times its color had become a kind of tired gray. This was an orphanage, one of many such places scattered across the city in that era, home to children whose families had been lost to poverty, illness, or simple disappearance. Inside, the halls were lit by low gas lamps that flickered against peeling wallpaper, and the smell of boiled vegetables and carbolic soap hung in the corridors long after the kitchen had gone quiet for the night. Most of the children were long asleep, tucked under thin blankets in narrow iron beds, their breathing slow and even in the dark. But in one small room near the end of the upstairs hall, a lamp still burned, and a woman was awake who would not see the morning. She was young, though hardship had aged her far beyond her years, and she was utterly alone in a way that had nothing to do with the empty hallway outside her door. She did not belong to this world in the way the other residents did. She had come from somewhere stranger, somewhere older, though nothing in her plain and threadbare coat would have told a passerby so. The hour was late, the fog outside pressing gently against the glass, and somewhere in that quiet room, between one breath and the next, a story that would unsettle the wizarding world for the better part of a century was about to begin. That story begins in Chapter 1, The Orphanage on Wol's Court, and it begins with the woman in the upstairs room, whose name was Merope Gaunt, though almost no one left alive that winter would have known it. She had walked into the orphanage some hours before, her coat too thin for the cold, her hands trembling not from fear, but from something closer to exhaustion. The kind that settles into a person after years of hardship finally catch up with her all at once. The staff who received her did not know what she was, only that she was clearly unwell, clearly alone, and clearly close to her time. She gave no family name that anyone could trace, no address, no history. She asked only that if the child lived and she did not, he be given a name. And she chose 2 names drawn from the men who had shaped her life in very different ways, and a third that belonged to her own father. The boy would be called Tom, after the man she had loved beyond reason, Marvolo, after the father who had ruled her childhood with cruelty and pride, and Riddle, a surname that carried no magic in it at all. Before the night was through, Merope Gaunt had died, quietly and without complaint, in the manner of someone who had already spent whatever will she had left, simply bringing her son into the world. The woman who ran the orphanage, a practical, weathered figure named Mrs. Cole, would remember for years afterward how strange the whole encounter had felt, though she could never quite say why. The orphanage on Wol's Court became the only home the boy would know for the next 11 years, and it was not, by any measure, a warm one. It was clean enough, orderly enough, and the staff were not unkind in any deliberate way, but it was also crowded and underfunded and short on the particular gentleness a child needs to feel that the world has a place for him. Tom Riddle grew up in narrow iron beds and long gray corridors, in a building where affection was rationed alongside the food, and where a child without visitors, without letters, without a single relative who ever came looking for him, learned early that he could expect very little from anyone. The other children did not warm to him, and it was not simply because he was solemn or watchful, though he was both of those things from a very young age. There was something about him that unsettled them, something the staff noticed too, though they struggled to put it into words beyond calling him odd, or difficult, or too clever by half for his own good. What they were noticing, though none of them had any framework to understand it, was magic, raw and untrained, and already beginning to bend itself to the boy's will. Tom discovered before he was out of his youngest years that he could make things happen simply by wanting them to happen very badly. Small animals seemed to sense something in him that other children did not provoke, and there were incidents, quietly witnessed and quickly hushed, of birds and stray creatures around the orphanage behaving strangely in his presence, drawing close to him or fleeing from him as though he held some authority over them that had nothing to do with size or strength. He learned, too, that he did not need to raise his voice or lift a hand to make another child afraid. A long, steady look was often enough. Something in his stillness, in the calm and unblinking way he could fix his attention on another person, carried a weight that made even older, bigger children step back without quite knowing why they had done it. He came to understand, long before he had any words for magic or wizards or Hogwarts, that he was different, and more importantly, that being different could be turned into being powerful if a person was patient and careful about how he used it. There was no one in his life to soften this discovery into something gentler. No one to explain that his strangeness came from a hidden world with its own history and its own rules. And so the boy built his own understanding out of what he had. He noticed that fear worked on people in ways that kindness never seemed to work on him, because kindness had rarely been offered to him in the first place, and fear, unlike kindness, was something he could create entirely on his own. Mrs. Cole would later describe him. When others eventually came asking, as a child who had never cried the way other infants cried, and who had seemed, even as a small boy, to be watching the world with a kind of calculation far beyond his years. It was not that he was born incapable of feeling, it was that so little in his early life had ever answered his feelings with warmth, and so he had quietly redirected all of that need for connection into something else. A hunger not to be loved, which seemed an impossible thing to secure, but to be obeyed, which did not. The orphanage's yearly outings offered a small window onto the world beyond Wool's Court, and it was on one such outing, deep into the countryside, where the air smelled of cut grass rather than soot, that the other children first became truly afraid of him, rather than merely uneasy around him. He had led two smaller boys into a shallow cave along the coast under the pretense of adventure. And whatever happened inside that cave, neither of the two would speak of it clearly afterward, only that they had come out pale and shaken and unwilling to be alone with him again. Mrs. Cole heard fragments of the story secondhand and chose, as she often did with matters concerning Tom, not to press too hard for details, telling herself that boys exaggerated and that nothing truly serious could have happened under her watch. It was easier, in a home stretched thin on staff and resources, to let such things settle into rumor than to investigate them fully, and Tom seemed to understand this about the adults around him with an instinct far too sharp for a child his age, learning that a calm face and a reasonable explanation could smooth over almost anything. He kept, in those years, a small tin box beneath a loose floorboard near his bed, and inside it he placed the little treasures he collected from the other children. Not valuable things, never valuable things, but a hair ribbon, a chipped marble, a small brass key that opened nothing he owned. He could not have explained, even to himself, why he took them. Only that each object gave him a private, satisfying sense of having reached into someone else's life and taken something back out of it. Proof that he could touch the world around him and leave a mark on it, even when no one was watching. It was the same quiet hunger that made him watch the other children so closely, cataloging their fears and their weaknesses the way another child might collect stamps or stones, patient and thorough, storing away knowledge he could not yet name a use for, but somehow already sensed would matter later. By the time he was a little older, Tom Riddle had become the sort of child other children avoided without being able to say precisely why. A boy who kept to himself in a room he treated as though it were his alone, who did not share his few small possessions, and who seemed to carry, even in silence, an unmistakable sense that he was owed more than the plain gray walls of Wool's Court could ever give him. He did not know yet where this feeling came from, this instinct that he was meant for something larger than an orphanage bed and a borrowed surname. He did not know that his mother's maiden name traced backward through generations of pride and isolation to a family that had once considered itself among the last true heirs of a founder of Hogwarts itself, or that the very name Riddle, which he already resented as plain and common, belonged only to the Muggle father who had never once come looking for him. He knew only that something in his blood felt larger than his circumstances, and that feeling, unexplained and unexamined, would follow him out of that orphanage and into everything he became. Up next in Chapter 2, The Gaunt Inheritance, we'll uncover the hidden bloodline behind that feeling, the ruined cottage and the proud, broken family who carried Salazar Slytherin's legacy into poverty and shadow, and the tangled, sorrowful path that led a desperate young witch named Merope Gaunt to the orphanage steps of Wool's Court in the first place. To understand where Merope Gaunt came from, and why her son entered the world with nothing but a borrowed name, it helps to travel backward a little, into the countryside near a village called Little Hangleton, and into Chapter 2, The Gaunt Inheritance, where a very different kind of poverty was waiting, one measured not in coins but in pride. Down a narrow lane, half hidden by overgrown hedges and neglected trees, stood a small stone shack that had clearly once been a caretaker's cottage and had since fallen into a state of quiet ruin. Ivy climbed unchecked across its walls, the windows were clouded with grime, and the garden around it had gone to weeds years before, tangled and wild in a way that suggested no one inside had the strength or the interest to tend it. Yet nailed above the door, absurd against the crumbling stone, hung the preserved skin of a snake, arranged as though it were a family crest, which, in its own strange way, it was. This was the home of Marvolo Gaunt and his two children, Morphin and Merope, the last surviving members of a family that had once been wealthy and respected, and had spent centuries since slowly losing everything except its conviction of its own greatness. The Gaunts believed themselves, with total and unshakable certainty, to be descended in an unbroken line from Salazar Slytherin, one of the 4 founders of Hogwarts, through a thread of ancestry that ran back through the ancient Peverell family. It was not an entirely groundless belief, for the blood did run true in one very particular way. Marvolo, and Morphin after him, were both parselmouths, able to speak the strange hissing language of serpents, a rare and famous gift long associated with Slytherin's line. And they treated this ability less as a curiosity and more as proof of a divine right that the rest of the wizarding world had simply failed to properly honor. Whatever fortune the family had once possessed, however, had long since been squandered or sold away, leaving Marvolo Gaunt to guard the last handful of family treasures with a jealous, almost feverish devotion. Chief among these was a heavy gold ring worn on his hand and never removed, set with a dark stone engraved with a design he insisted was the Peverell coat of arms, a triangle, a circle, and a line drawn through them both. Though what that symbol truly represented was a mystery even to him. There was also a locket, smaller and no less prized, said to have belonged to Salazar Slytherin himself, passed down through the family as its most sacred possession. Poverty, though, has a way of eroding sentiment, and Merope, quiet and overlooked in that household, would later be forced to sell the locket for a fraction of its worth simply to survive. A small tragedy that would echo forward into a much larger one many years later. Life inside the gaunt cottage was neither comfortable nor kind. Marvolo ruled his children with the same volatile pride that governed everything else about him, quick to anger, contemptuous of Merope in particular, whom he seemed to regard as a disappointment simply for existing, plain and quiet and lacking in the fierce gaunt temperament he prized in his son. Morphin, for his part, had inherited his father's cruelty, without softening it in the slightest, and the two of them spent their days in near isolation from the rest of the wizarding world, resentful of muggles, resentful of other wizarding families they considered beneath their bloodline despite having far more wealth and standing, and resentful, in Marvolo's case, of nearly everyone who crossed his path. Merope alone seemed to carry something gentler beneath the family's hardened exterior, though it had been buried so deeply under years of neglect that it rarely had the chance to show itself. It was in this narrow, closed-off life that Merope's gaze fell, quietly and then desperately, on a young man who lived nearby, the son of the wealthy family at the manor house on the hill above the village. His name, as it happened, was Tom Riddle, a handsome and confident young muggle who had no idea the strange, dark-eyed girl, who sometimes watched him from behind the hedges, even existed in any way that mattered to him. Merope's love for him grew into something all-consuming, made only more painful by the total impossibility of it in her father's eyes, and by the young man's complete indifference to her presence. When Marvolo discovered what his daughter felt, and worse, that Morphin had witnessed Tom Riddle passing by their gate, the confrontation that followed ended in violence, and in both men being taken away by the authorities, leaving Merope alone in the cottage for the first time in her life. It was then, free of her father's constant shadow, that she made the choice that would define the rest of her short life. She turned to the darkest kind of shortcut available to a desperate witch, a love potion, administered patiently and carefully until the young muggle, who had never once looked at her twice, began to look at her as though she were the only woman in the world. Under that spell, the two of them married, and for a brief season, Merope experienced something she had likely never known before, a version of happiness, however artificial its foundation. But love bought this way cannot be sustained forever, and at some point, whether from her own hope that real affection had grown between them or from simple exhaustion, Merope stopped giving him the potion. The effect broke almost immediately, and the young man who woke from that fog found himself married to a woman he did not love, in a life he did not recognize as his own, and he left her, returning to his family home and never once looking back. Pregnant, penniless, and abandoned, Merope made her way slowly toward London, selling the last of her family's treasures along the way simply to survive, until she arrived, cold and failing, at the door of an ordinary orphanage on a narrow lane called Wool's Court, in the final days of 1926, where her story folds back into the one already told, and where, having given her son a name built from grief and pride in equal measure, she closed her eyes for the last time. Up next in Chapter 3, The Letter and the Visit, we'll uncover what became of that son 11 years later, when a calm and watchful stranger arrived at the orphanage on Wool's Court to tell him, for the very first time, exactly what kind of blood truly ran through his veins. By the late summer of 1938, the boy from the orphanage on Wool's Court had grown into an 11-year-old with a sharp, watchful face and a manner far too composed for his age. And it is here, in Chapter 3, The Letter and the Visit, that his quiet, ordinary world was finally interrupted by something extraordinary. Mrs. Cole had run the orphanage long enough by then to have developed careful instincts about her charges, and Tom Riddle had never sat easily with those instincts. He was intelligent, certainly, and outwardly polite when it suited him, but there was a coldness beneath the politeness that unsettled her, along with a habit of collecting small things that were never quite his. Hidden away among his few possessions was a modest hoard of little trinkets, a yo-yo, a thimble, a mouth organ, small ordinary objects that had once belonged to other children at the orphanage, kept not for their value, but seemingly for the private satisfaction of having taken them. There had been other troubling moments too, spoken of only in hushed and uncertain tones among the staff. A wardrobe in one of the dormitories had caught fire under circumstances no one could quite explain. During a summer outing to the countryside, a rabbit belonging to another child had been badly hurt not long after Tom himself had been punished for something, and though nothing was ever proven, the timing left a quiet unease that lingered over him long after the incident had been officially forgotten. It was into this uneasy household that Albus Dumbledore arrived on an ordinary afternoon, dressed in a manner Mrs. Cole found peculiar even by the standards of eccentric visitors, and carrying himself with a calm, unhurried authority that seemed to fill the small office where they spoke, without him ever needing to raise his voice. He explained, gently and patiently, that he represented a school, and that Tom had been offered a place there, a place unlike any other kind of school in the world. Mrs. Cole, flustered and unused to such visitors, found herself agreeing to things she barely understood, soothed by something in Dumbledore's manner that made resistance feel unnecessary, though she could never afterward say exactly how he had managed it. When Dumbledore finally sat across from Tom Riddle himself, he found a boy who received the news of his own magical nature with far less astonishment than most children might have shown. Tom listened as he was told, calmly and directly, that the strange things he had always been able to do, the fires that started around him, the small animals that obeyed him, the fear he could summon in other children without lifting a finger, all of it had a name and a cause, and that he was, in fact, a wizard. Rather than wonder or delight, what crossed Tom's face first was something closer to recognition, as though a private suspicion he had carried for years had finally been confirmed rather than revealed. He asked, with unusual bluntness for a boy his age, whether it was true that he could do things others could not, and whether this made him different from everyone around him in some deeper, more permanent way. Dumbledore did not flatter him with an answer larger than the truth deserved, but he did not shrink from it either, telling him plainly that magic was indeed unusual and powerful, and that it came with responsibilities as serious as its gifts. It was in that same conversation that Tom, testing the boundaries of this new authority figure in front of him, let a flash of something darker show itself. He suggested, almost as a threat disguised as a question, that he could make things happen to people who upset him, people who deserved it, and there was a coldness in the way he said it that made clear he was not simply describing a talent but weighing its uses. Dumbledore's response was immediate and unwavering, delivered without anger, but without the slightest room for negotiation either. He told the boy, calmly and firmly, that magic was never to be used as a weapon against others, that Hogwarts had rules precisely because gifts, such as his, required discipline rather than indulgence, and that any further trouble of that kind would be dealt with severely. Something in the older wizard's steady, unblinking composure reached the boy in a way little else ever had. Not fear exactly, but a recognition that here, for the first time, was someone he could not simply intimidate into silence, and Tom's manner shifted almost at once into something more careful and more contained. Before Dumbledore left the orphanage that day, he answered, briefly and without excessive detail, the questions Tom asked about where such gifts came from, and Tom learned for the first time that his mother, whom he had always assumed to be an ordinary woman incapable of magic since she had died in an ordinary Muggle building, had in fact been a witch herself. He learned that his surname, Riddle, came from his Muggle father, a man who had apparently wanted nothing to do with him, and that whatever true legacy he carried came instead through his mother's side. A thread Dumbledore did not fully unravel in that first meeting, though he mentioned, carefully, that there was more to be learned about his family in time. He was given a letter, sealed in heavy parchment and addressed to him by name, inviting him to attend Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry that coming September, and told that his supplies would be gathered with assistance, since he had, of course, no one else to take him. Tom Riddle left that meeting with far more than a letter. He left with the first real sense of belonging he had ever known, not to a family, not yet, but to a world that finally explained him. A world in which his strangeness was not a flaw to be hidden, but a kind of birthright waiting to be claimed. He held on to Dumbledore's warning quietly, tucked away much as he had once tucked away his small stolen trophies, filed under things to be more careful about, rather than things to be abandoned altogether. Up next in Chapter 4, A Boy Named Riddle at Hogwarts, we'll uncover what happened when that same watchful, ambitious boy stepped off the train in September of 1938 and walked, for the very first time, beneath the enchanted ceiling of the Great Hall. In September of 1938, the boy who had spent his entire life within the narrow gray walls of an orphanage stepped through the doors of the Great Hall at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, and it is here that Chapter 4, A Boy Named Riddle at Hogwarts, truly begins. The ceiling above him mirrored the night sky outside, scattered with candlelight and stars, and the long house tables stretched out before him, crowded with students who had grown up knowing this world their entire lives, who had parents and siblings and family names that meant something the moment they were spoken. Tom Riddle had none of that inheritance to lean on as he waited his turn among the first years. And yet, he did not appear nervous in the way so many of the other new students did. He stood quietly, watching everything with the same careful, unblinking attention he had once turned on frightened children back at the orphanage, absorbing the layout of power in this new world, with the instincts of someone who had spent his whole life learning to read a room for advantage. When his name was finally called and the ancient patched hat was lowered onto his head, it took only a moment of quiet deliberation before it called out its verdict, and Tom Riddle became a member of Slytherin House. It was, in many ways, the most natural sorting the hat could have made, for the very qualities the boy had cultivated in the absence of love, ambition, cunning, a fierce and private drive to matter, were the very qualities that House was built to recognize and reward. He took his seat at the Slytherin table beneath the hall's green and silver banners, and something in him settled, quietly and completely, the way a key settles into a lock it was always meant to fit. What his new housemates noticed first about him was not coldness, though that lived in him too, but charm, a natural, almost effortless ability to say precisely what another person wanted to hear. to appear interested in whatever mattered most to whoever he was speaking with, to make himself seem, within a very short time, indispensable to nearly everyone around him. Teachers found him attentive and unusually mature, quick with his answers, and eager to please in all the ways that mattered to people who had authority over him. Other students found him easy to talk to, flattering in small, careful doses, and quietly impressive in a way that made them want to stand near him rather than against him. Beneath all of this, carefully hidden, ran a colder and more calculating current, an understanding, sharpened over years of having nothing, that people were far easier to lead than to fight, and that charm, deployed correctly, was simply another form of the control he had first discovered as a small boy able to frighten other children without ever raising his hand. It did not take him long to gather around himself a small circle of other students, boys drawn from prominent pure-blood families who found in Tom Riddle something they had not expected to find in a classmate of uncertain background, a leader more confident, more capable, and more compelling than any of them, one who seemed to know instinctively how to make each of them feel chosen, trusted with something the rest of the house was not. He listened more than he spoke in those early conversations, learning who came from which family, who held old grudges against whom, who could be useful later and who could be safely dismissed, filing it all away with the same patient, meticulous care he had once used to catalog his small stolen trinkets back on Wool's Court. His followers did not think of themselves, in those first months, as followers at all. They believed they had simply found a remarkable friend. Only one thing seemed to genuinely trouble the surface of his composure, and it was, of all things, his own name. Tom was common, unremarkable, a name that could belong to any number of ordinary boys in any number of ordinary Muggle households, and it grated against him precisely because it tied him to the father who had wanted no part of him, a Muggle man he had never met and had already, in his heart, come to despise. He carried the name Riddle the way a person carries a stone in a shoe, aware of it constantly, irritated by it privately, and increasingly determined that it would not be the name history remembered him by. He had been told, in that brief conversation at the orphanage, that his mother had been a witch, and the thought took root in him with surprising speed and depth, that his true worth, his true legacy, lay somewhere in her side of the family rather than his father's, somewhere he had not yet been permitted to see. It was this quiet, private hunger that first sent him, in stolen hours between lessons, to the shelves of the Hogwarts library, searching not through his coursework, but through old records of wizarding families, genealogies, and histories of the school's founders. He found himself drawn again and again to accounts of Salazar Slytherin, the founder whose house now claimed him, a wizard famous for his rare and formidable gift of parseltongue, the very ability to speak with serpents that Tom had begun to suspect, quietly and without yet daring to test it, might live somewhere inside his own blood. He said nothing of this suspicion to his new circle of admirers, not yet, keeping it instead exactly where he kept everything that mattered most to him, folded away in careful silence, waiting for the moment he could prove it beyond doubt. Up next in Chapter 5, the heir of Slytherin will uncover what Tom Riddle found when he finally traced that suspicion back through the ruined Gaunt bloodline to its source, and how a discovery about serpents and secrets buried deep beneath the school would set him on the path toward becoming the darkest wizard of his age. By his third year at Hogwarts, Tom Riddle had learned a great deal in the school library that no one had thought to teach him in class. He would sit for hours at a table in the farthest corner, beneath a window that let in a pale gray light, working his way through old volumes on wizarding genealogy, on the founders of the school. on the ancient and noble houses whose bloodlines were said to stretch back 1,000 years. He was searching for himself. He wanted a name that belonged to him, a family that had never abandoned him in a corridor of stone and iron beds. And in time, patiently, the way he did everything, he found it. That story begins in Chapter 5, The Heir of Slytherin. The name Riddle meant nothing in the wizarding world, and he had known that since Dumbledore first told him what he was. But his mother's name, Gaunt, appeared again and again in the old records, tangled through footnotes about pure blood and vanished fortunes, until at last it led him somewhere extraordinary. The Gaunts, he read, descended in an unbroken line from Salazar Slytherin himself, one of the 4 founders of Hogwarts, a wizard so gifted and so guarded that he had built a hidden chamber beneath the very castle where Tom now sat reading. The discovery moved through him like warmth, returning to a frozen limb. He was not simply a boy from an orphanage. He was the last living heir of one of the greatest wizards who had ever lived. It was around this time that he first realized he could speak to snakes. He had always had a quiet way with animals, an instinct for finding the soft places in living things. But this was different. In the school greenhouses, and later in the grass near the lake, he found that when a snake moved past him, he could open his mouth and produce a low hissing speech that the creature seemed to understand perfectly, and that answered back. He kept this discovery to himself at first, turning it over in his mind, the way a person turns over a stone to see what lives beneath it. He soon learned the word for it, Parseltongue, an ability so rare that it was said to run in only a few great families, chief among them the line of Salazar Slytherin. Everything was beginning to fit together, quietly and precisely, like a key easing into a lock built especially for it. He read every account he could find of the legend that had followed Slytherin's name through the centuries, the story of a hidden chamber built somewhere within Hogwarts, sealed away and left for a true heir to open when the time came. Some called it a rumor. Some called it a comforting old ghost story told to first years on rainy nights. Tom did not think it was either. He believed it the way he believed very few things in his life, with a certainty that settled into his bones and asked no permission from doubt. He began to imagine, in the private theater of his mind, what it might mean to be the one who finally opened it. He kept these discoveries folded away from his housemates, the way he kept most things that mattered to him, sharing only the smallest, most flattering pieces of himself with the small circle of students who had already begun to gather around him. To them, he remained simply Tom, clever and composed, a boy other students found themselves wanting to please without quite knowing why. None of them saw the hours he spent bent over dusty registers in the library's oldest shelves, tracing the thin, broken branches of the Gaunt family tree back through centuries of intermarriage and pride, watching the name Slytherin surface again and again like a stone rising slowly out of still water. Each new confirmation settled something in him that had never once felt settled before, a certainty that the orphanage on Wool's Court had been nothing more than an accident of circumstance, a temporary and unworthy resting place for a boy who belonged, by blood, somewhere far grander. That summer, not yet 17, he left the orphanage on a quiet errand of his own and traveled to a village called Little Hangleton, a place he had never seen but had heard whispered of in old family records, the place where his mother's people had once lived in a crumbling stone cottage at the edge of the woods. He found it easily enough once he arrived, a low, dark structure half swallowed by nettles, its windows boarded, its chimney leaning, looking more like something grown from the earth than built upon it. It was there that he found his uncle, Morphin Gaunt, a wild and unwashed man with the family ring still on his finger, living alone in squalor with a handful of snakes for company and decades of bitterness curdled inside him. Morphin did not welcome him gently. He was suspicious of the well-spoken young stranger who had come asking about his sister Merope, the sister he had never forgiven for running off with a Muggle man from the grand house on the hill. But Tom was patient, and Tom was clever, and he had a gift, even then, for drawing out exactly the information he wanted from people who did not realize how much they were giving away. He learned the whole sad history that night, of his grandfather Marvolo's pride and poverty, of his mother's quiet, hopeless love, of the Muggle man named Tom Riddle, who had lived in the manor beyond the trees, the very man whose name Tom himself now carried like a stone in his pocket. Not far from the gaunt cottage stood that manor, grand and well-kept, home to the Riddle family. The Muggle father, who had never known his son existed, and the grandparents who had never wanted their boy to marry a woman like Merope Gaunt at all. In the summer of 1943, tragedy came to that house. The Riddles were found dead within its walls, all three of them, with no visible wound and no explanation that the local doctors or the police could ever settle upon. The village called it a horror. The Ministry of Magic quietly investigated and closed its file just as quietly. And when the dust of it settled, it was Morphin Gaunt who was blamed, found near the manor with his wand still in hand and no memory of what he had done. A bitter, friendless man that no one felt inclined to defend. He was sent away to Azkaban for the rest of his life, believing, in the fog that had been carefully placed over his mind, that he alone was responsible. He was not. It was Tom Riddle, the grandson Morphin never knew he had entertained that night, who walked away from Little Hangleton with a family secret settled at last, and a family ring taken quietly from his uncle's cottage, leaving behind him a story arranged so carefully that no one would ever think to look past it. He said nothing of this to anyone, and he returned to Hogwarts that autumn as composed and as charming as he had always been, a model student with a secret now folded away inside him like a knife wrapped in velvet. He was Slytherin's heir in blood and in name, and he had already begun to prove, quietly, exactly what that inheritance meant to him. He carried this knowledge back through the castle gates with him, and, in the long, hushed nights of his 5th year, it would not stay quiet within him for long. Up next in Chapter 6, The Beast Beneath the School, we'll uncover what Tom Riddle did with the secret he had claimed as his birthright, and the ancient creature that had been waiting, patiently, in the dark beneath Hogwarts, for someone at last to call it by name. There is a particular kind of quiet that falls over an old castle late at night, when even the portraits have stopped whispering and the torches have burned low along the corridors. It was in that kind of quiet, in his 5th year at Hogwarts, that Tom Riddle finally went looking for the entrance his ancestor had left behind 13 centuries before. That story unfolds now in Chapter 6, The Beast Beneath the School. He had spent 2 years since his visit to the gaunt cottage learning everything he could about the layout of the ancient castle, its plumbing and its passages, its quiet, forgotten corners that the current staff had long since stopped thinking about. He believed, correctly, that the entrance to the fabled Chamber of Secrets lay somewhere within a bathroom on the 2nd floor, a bathroom that had fallen out of general use, plagued as it was by a leaking tap and a general air of neglect. It was there, standing before the row of sinks in the flickering candlelight, that he spoke the hissing words of Parseltongue aloud for the very first time with purpose, and felt the stone shift and open beneath his feet, revealing a passage that dropped away into darkness and had not seen daylight in nearly 1,000 years. What lived at the bottom of that passage was a serpent unlike any other in the world, a basilisk grown enormous and ancient in the dark. A creature whose gaze alone could end a life in an instant, and whose lesser glance, caught only sideways or through some reflected surface, could leave a person frozen in a deep and dreamless stillness instead. Salazar Slytherin had left it there long ago, sealed away and sleeping, meant only to be woken by an heir of his own blood, someone who could speak to it and command it as one speaks to an old and loyal friend. Tom found that he could. The creature listened to him, and in the weeks that followed, quietly, carefully, he began to let it out. The attacks that followed were treated by the school as a mystery, both frightening and confusing, occurring exactly as the old legend had described. Students found here and there about the castle in a strange, still sleep from which no charm could wake them, having caught only a filtered glimpse of the basilisk's eyes. Among the small number of students who suffered a far gentler fate that year was a girl named Myrtle, a shy and often overlooked Ravenclaw who liked to spend her free hours crying quietly in that very bathroom on the second floor, away from classmates who teased her about her glasses and her plainness. It was there that she encountered the basilisk directly one evening, and her life ended so suddenly and so painlessly that she herself would later say she barely understood, in that first moment, that anything at all had changed. In the years that followed, her spirit remained gently attached to that same bathroom, and the students of later generations would come to know her fondly, if a little sadly, as Moaning Myrtle, forever young, forever wandering the pipes and stalls of the place where her story had paused. The castle, understandably, was thrown into fear. Parents wrote anxious letters. The staff searched for answers. And it was here that Tom Riddle showed the world, for the first time in any real way, just how far his gift for shaping a story could carry him. His eye fell upon a fellow student 2 years below him, a large, warm-hearted, gentle boy named Rubeus Hagrid, who had been quietly keeping an enormous acromantula as a pet in a hidden corner of the castle, having reared the 8-legged creature from a small hatchling out of nothing but a soft spot for strange and unwanted things. The spider's name was Aragog, and though Aragog had never harmed a single soul at Hogwarts, his sheer size and his unusual nature made him an easy shape to press the school's fear into. Tom saw the opportunity and did not hesitate to use it. He let it be known, carefully and indirectly, in the places where such things travel fastest, that Hagrid's creature might be responsible for what was happening in the castle. He did this while presenting himself to every teacher and every prefect who crossed his path as calm, concerned, and helpful beyond his years, a model student determined to see the attacks stopped and his fellow students kept safe. It worked exactly as he intended. Hagrid was accused, his beloved companion taken from him and believed destroyed, and the third-year boy himself expelled from the only home he had ever truly loved, his wand snapped in half, sent away from Hogwarts in disgrace for a crime he had never committed. Tom, meanwhile, was praised. The attacks stopped, at least for a time. Once he judged it safest to close the chamber and let the basilisk rest again in the dark. He was given credit, quiet and widespread, for helping to end the crisis. And no one, not even the venerable headmaster, who watched him with a faint and careful curiosity, ever learned the truth of where the danger had truly come from. It was a small taste of something Tom Riddle would spend the rest of his long life perfecting, the art of stepping behind another person's shoulders and letting them carry the weight of what he himself had done, all while he stood in the light, admired, untouched, believed. Hagrid, for his part, carried the sorrow of that year quietly for decades afterward, though kindness followed him even in exile, and the truth would not surface until many years later, once new eyes finally came looking for it. But that spring, as the last of the frightened whispers in the corridors began to fade, Tom Riddle was left with a different kind of unease entirely, one that had nothing to do with secrets or suspicion, and everything to do with something far larger pressing quietly at the edges of his mind. Stick around for Chapter 7, A Question of Immortality, where we'll uncover the fear that had begun to take root in him long before that year, and the strange, careful questions he would soon start asking about the one thing every living creature, however powerful, must someday face. There was one subject that had followed Tom Riddle since he was a very small boy, quieter than his ambition and older than his cunning, and it was this. He was afraid, more deeply than he ever let another person see, of dying. That fear, and the strange places it would eventually lead him, is where we pick up the thread now, in Chapter 7, A Question of Immortality. The roots of it reached back before he could even remember, to a mother he never knew, a thin and worn-down young woman named Merup, who had given birth to him in a cold London winter and let go of her own life within hours. Too weakened by grief and hardship to hold on any longer, leaving her son behind in the care of strangers before he had even opened his eyes to look at her. Tom grew up with the bare, second-hand knowledge that his mother had died an ordinary and human death. The kind of death that came not from a duel or a curse, but simply from weakness, from the body giving out when the will behind it had nothing left to fight with. He found the thought unbearable. To him, it did not read as sadness. It read as failure, a mistake he promised himself, in the silent, private way that children make vows that he would never make. His father offered him a different kind of lesson in mortality, one no less unsettling to a boy already building his identity around the idea of his own greatness. Tom Riddle Sr. had been an ordinary man, a muggle with no magic in him at all, a man who lived and worked and eventually died just as any person without power must, subject entirely to time and chance and the slow wearing down of years. Learning of his father's utterly human nature only sharpened something in young Tom, a growing conviction that the ordinary rules of life and death, the rules that had claimed his mother's strength and defined his father's plainness, were rules meant for lesser people, not for him. By the time he reached his final years at Hogwarts, this private preoccupation had become something he allowed himself to explore more openly, at least with the one professor he trusted enough, in his careful, calculated way, to draw close. Horace Slowhorn taught potions at the school and kept a small, favored circle of talented students near him, a collection he was rather fond of privately calling his club, and Tom had made certain, as he made certain of most things, to find his way into it. Slughorn liked him enormously. Tom was polite, attentive, endlessly complimentary in exactly the right measure, and possessed of a mind that Slughorn found genuinely dazzling. It made him an easy man to talk to, and an even easier man to draw information from without ever seeming to ask for it directly. One evening, in the warm, cluttered comfort of Slughorn's office, over the kind of rich and idle conversation the older man loved best, Tom steered the discussion toward a subject far darker than either of them let on aloud. The old and forbidden idea of dividing the human soul as a means of escaping death altogether. He asked his questions the way he asked everything, lightly, curiously, as though the matter were simply one more fascinating curiosity among the many he liked to collect, rather than the center of everything he had been quietly working toward for years. Slughorn, uneasy but flattered, and never quite able to refuse this particular student anything, spoke more than he meant to. It was in that conversation that a single word passed between them and lodged itself permanently into the future of the wizarding world. Horcrux. Neither the professor nor the student dwelled long on the word that night, and neither would speak of it again for many years. But it had been said, and Tom Riddle did not forget things that were said to him. that was not the whole of his final year, of course. To every eye around him, he remained simply an exceptional student, perhaps the most gifted the school had seen in a generation, moving calmly and successfully through his final examinations in the spring of 1945. When the results came in, they confirmed what most of the staff already believed. He left Hogwarts having earned top marks across nearly every subject he had studied, and alongside his results came a rare and cherished honor, the award for special services to the school, granted to him in quiet recognition of his role, or so the record stated, in helping to end the frightening events of his 5th year. He accepted it with the same modest, gracious warmth he had shown for 7 years, bowing his head slightly as the applause moved through the great hall, none of the assembled staff and students able to see even a trace of the private plans already forming behind his composed and handsome face. He left the castle that summer as one of its most celebrated graduates in living memory, admired, trusted, and utterly unknown to anyone who thought they understood him. Up next in Chapter 8, Borgin and Burkes will uncover where Tom Riddle went once the doors of Hogwarts closed behind him for the final time, and the quiet, unassuming shop in a shadowed London alley where his long search for power and permanence would take its next careful step. When Tom Riddle left Hogwarts in the summer of 1945, he did not walk into the kind of future his teachers had imagined for him. No one expected the school's most decorated graduate in years to seek work in the narrow, crooked lane of Knockturn Alley, tucked away behind Diagon Alley in a part of London that respectable witches and wizards preferred not to linger in after dark. But that is exactly where he went, and that is where our story continues now, in Chapter 8, Borgin and Burkes. The shop was dim and crowded, its shelves lined with objects most people would rather not touch, cursed opera glasses, shrunken heads, jewelry that hummed faintly with old and unpleasant magic, cabinets that were rumored to do a great deal more than store linens. It was a place built for people who collected dangerous, beautiful, forbidden things, and Tom Riddle, still young, still strikingly handsome, still possessed of that same easy, disarming charm that had carried him so smoothly through school, fit into it with unsettling comfort. The owners, Mr. Borgin and Mr. Burke, found him an excellent employee, quiet and courteous with customers, endlessly knowledgeable about the history and provenance of the strange items that passed through their hands, and gifted, in a way they perhaps did not examine too closely, at persuading the most reluctant sellers to finally part with their treasures. It was in this work that he came to know an elderly witch named Hepzibah Smith, a wealthy and rather lonely woman who lived alone with only a house elf for company, surrounded by a lifetime of collected magical treasures she loved discussing more than almost anything else in the world. Tom was sent to call on her from time to time on behalf of the shop, and he did so with patience and warmth that made him, in a short while, one of her favorite visitors. He listened to her stories. He admired her collection with what appeared to be genuine fascination. He remembered small details about her life and asked after them the next time he came, the same quiet, careful attentiveness he had once used on Horace Slughorn, turned now toward a woman who had no idea how closely she was being studied. In time, flattered and utterly charmed, Hepzibah showed him the 2 objects she treasured above everything else she owned. The first was a small golden cup, engraved with a badger, and said to have once belonged to Helga Hufflepuff herself, passed down through generations until it came to rest, quite by chance, in her own careful hands. The second she kept locked away even more carefully, a heavy locket, ornate and ancient, bearing a small, engraved letter that marked it as an heirloom of Salazar Slytherin, passed down through the very same Gaunt family whose ruined cottage Tom had visited years before and sold long ago, in a moment of desperate poverty, before eventually finding its way into Hepzibah's collection. Tom looked upon that locket with an interest he could barely disguise, though to Hepzibah, delighted by his attention, it simply seemed as though her favorite young visitor shared her love of beautiful, storied things. Not long after that visit, Hepzibah Smith passed away quietly in her home, her death gentle and quick, attributed at the time to an unfortunate turn in her health rather than to anything more sinister, and her devoted house elf was left to carry the sad weight of it. When the matter was looked into more carefully, both of her most prized possessions, the golden cup and the ancient locket, were found to be missing from her collection entirely, as though they had simply vanished from the house alongside her. And around that very same time, Tom Riddle himself stopped appearing at Borgin and Burke's. He did not resign in any formal way, and he left no note or explanation behind him. He was simply, one ordinary morning, gone, his employers left to shrug and wonder, and eventually stop asking, as the shop's shelves filled again with new and different curiosities, and his name slowly faded from the conversations of Nocturne Alley. No one connected to that quiet shop, and no one in the wider wizarding world saw Tom Riddle again for a long, long while. He had stepped, quite deliberately, out of every record and every familiar face that had known him, carrying with him two of the most treasured magical objects in Britain, and a private purpose that he had been building toward, patiently and secretly, since he was a boy of 11, learning for the first time what he truly was. Ahead of him lay years of travel across distant countries, through libraries and dark corners of the wizarding world that most witches and wizards never so much as glimpsed, in search of magic older and darker than anything even Hogwarts had ever offered him. That long and shadowed chapter of his life is the one we turn to next. Stick around for Chapter 9, Years in the Wilderness, where we'll uncover where Tom Riddle traveled once he vanished from the streets of London, and how the quiet, charming young man the wizarding world once knew slowly began to disappear inside someone else entirely. When the young man who had once been Tom Riddle walked out of the door of Borgin and Burke's for the final time, he carried with him two treasures that were not his to keep: a small fortune in Hepzibah Smith's gold, and a silence about his own past that would soon become total. That story of vanishing, of a decade spent beyond the edges of anything the wizarding world of Britain could easily trace, belongs to Chapter 9, Years in the Wilderness, and it begins with nothing more than an empty desk and a resignation letter left behind at an antique shop on Nocturne Alley, and a young clerk who was never seen in that part of London again. For those who had known him only as a polite and gifted employee, his disappearance seemed strange but not alarming. The sort of thing restless young men sometimes did in the years after a war had reshaped the world around them. Nobody connected him to the quiet death of an elderly collector, and nobody thought to ask where a poor orphan from a London institution might have found the means to travel. He simply was not there 1 week, and by the time anyone thought to wonder about him, he was already very far away, and the trail he left behind had gone as cold and still as the winter fog that once hung over Wool's Court. What followed were years that history would only ever piece together in fragments, drawn from rumor, from half-remembered sightings, from the testimony of those few who claimed to have crossed his path and lived to regret it. He traveled first through the more shadowed corners of magical Europe, drifting through old market towns in the Black Forest, through the crooked back streets of cities whose wizarding quarters had never bothered to align themselves with any ministry, and further still into regions where the old magic had never been tidied away into ministries and classrooms at all. He sought out those who studied magic that respectable schools like Hogwarts declined to teach, magic concerned with power over life, over death, over the boundaries between a soul and the body that carried it. He was not interested in comfort during these years, nor in companionship, nor in anything that might have been called an ordinary life. He wanted only knowledge, and he pursued it with the same patient, focused hunger that had once made him the top student of his year. It is said, in the careful and half-frightened way such things tend to be said, that he sought out remnants of ancient and forbidden magical traditions in places far removed from anything a British wizard would recognize as home. That he sat for a time among practitioners whose methods were old before Hogwarts was founded, and that he studied under teachers who themselves preferred never to be named. Whatever he learned in those years, he learned thoroughly, and he learned it alone, trusting no one enough to make of them a true companion. Those who encountered him during this period, briefly and rarely, described a young man of extraordinary charm and extraordinary coldness in equal measure. Someone who could win trust in a matter of minutes and discard it just as quickly once it had served its purpose. Wherever he passed through, he left behind an impression that lingered long after he had gone, an unease that people struggled to explain, as though they had briefly stood near something that did not behave quite the way a person should. The years abroad hardened whatever had already begun to harden in him during his years at school. Whatever remained of the frightened boy who had once shown a wardrobe how to catch fire out of pure, desperate anger seemed to have been folded away entirely, replaced by someone colder, more deliberate, and infinitely more dangerous. He had gone looking for power beyond the ordinary limits of magic, and by slow degrees, across those wandering years, he found enough of it to begin building the shape of the man, if he could still be called that, whom the wizarding world would one day learn to fear by name. When he finally returned to Britain, the orphan named Tom Riddle did not come back. In his place was a figure who introduced himself under a new name entirely, one he had constructed with the same care he applied to every part of his transformation. He called himself Lord Voldemort, a name built from the letters of his own, rearranged into something that sounded foreign and commanding, stripped entirely of any hint of the Muggle father he despised. Few at first knew that the two names belonged to the same person, and that was precisely how he wanted it. The name Riddle was a discarded skin, a reminder of weakness and unwanted parentage, and Lord Voldemort was the armor he had built to replace it. It was under this new name, sometime in the 1950s, that he arrived at the gates of Hogwarts once more, this time not as a student, but as an applicant, seeking the post of Defense Against the Dark Arts professor. He came before Headmaster Albus Dumbledore with all the practiced charm that had carried him so far in life, presenting himself as an accomplished and worldly wizard eager to pass along what he had learned in his travels. But Dumbledore had known him as a boy, had seen the small hoard of stolen trophies in an orphanage wardrobe, had watched him grow through his years at school with a caution that never fully relaxed, and he was not so easily persuaded by charm alone. The headmaster looked at the man across the desk from him and saw, beneath the polish and the practiced warmth, something that unsettled him deeply, though he kept his expression calm and his voice even. The interview ended in a refusal, quiet but unmistakable, and Voldemort left the castle that day, having been turned away from the one place that had ever, briefly, felt like home to him. It was said afterward, in the hushed and superstitious way that such stories travel through a school full of impressionable young witches and wizards, that something changed in the Defense Against the Dark Arts position from that day onward, that no teacher who took the post ever seemed to last beyond a single year, whether through misfortune, resignation, or stranger causes still. Whether this was truly the doing of the man who had been refused, or merely a legend that grew up around a position that already seemed prone to bad luck, Nobody could say for certain, but the whispers persisted for decades, passed from student to student long after the true reason for them had been half forgotten. Refused at the door of Hogwarts, Voldemort turned his considerable will toward a different kind of building entirely. Not a castle of stone and staircases, but a following of loyal and devoted witches and wizards who would carry out his ambitions in the wider world. Up next in Chapter 10, Gathering the Faithful, we'll uncover how a quiet, patient campaign of recruitment across the decades that followed drew together the men and women who would one day be known as the Death Eaters, and how a mark burned into their arms would come to mean more than any of them yet understood. After the quiet refusal at the gates of Hogwarts, the man who called himself Lord Voldemort did not retreat from the wizarding world so much as begin to move through it differently, more patiently, more deliberately, gathering around himself the pieces of something far larger than a single ambitious wizard working alone. That slow and careful assembly of followers is the subject of Chapter 10, Gathering the Faithful. And it unfolded not in a single dramatic gesture, but across 2 decades of quiet conversations, private gatherings, and the gradual bending of impressionable minds toward his growing vision of the world. The 1950s and 1960s were, on the surface, unremarkable years for magical Britain, a time of school terms and ministry announcements and the ordinary rhythms of wizarding life continuing much as they always had. But beneath that calm surface, in drawing rooms and private clubs frequented by old and wealthy pure-blood families, a different kind of conversation had begun to take root. Voldemort understood, with the same instinctive cunning that had once let a lonely orphan charm his way into the good graces of an elderly shop owner, exactly which doors would open to him, and exactly what words would make a listener lean in closer. He found his earliest and most receptive audience among families who prized the purity of their magical bloodlines above nearly everything else. Families who had spent generations quietly convinced that wizards born to non-magical parents diluted something precious and ancient, and that the ministry of magic had grown soft and misguided in its tolerance of a changing world. To these families and their sons and daughters, Voldemort did not present himself as a monster, for that would have won him nothing. He presented himself as a visionary, a brilliant and cultured wizard, who understood better than anyone the old truths that the modern ministry had allowed to be forgotten, and who offered not cruelty, but a kind of belonging, a promise that those who joined him would stand among the deserving few at the center of a new and rightful order. It was an intoxicating offer to young people raised on stories of their own family's greatness, and one by one, quietly, carefully, he drew them in. Among those who came to him in these years was a young witch named Bellatrix, born into one such proud and ancient family, whose devotion to him would grow, across the years that followed, into something fierce and absolute, a loyalty that seemed to burn brighter in her than in almost anyone else who ever knelt before him. Alongside her came Lucius Malfoy, elegant and ambitious, a young man whose family had long moved in circles of wealth and influence, and who saw in Voldemort's growing movement both a kindred philosophy and a useful path toward power. And in the years that followed, drawn from a very different corner of the wizarding world, came a quieter and more guarded young man named Severus Snape, a gifted student of potions and the darker corners of magic, whose reasons for seeking out Voldemort's circle were tangled and complicated in ways that would not become clear to the wider world for many years to come. These were not the only ones. Across the 1960s and into the 1970s, a steady trickle of witches and wizards found their way into Voldemort's growing circle, some drawn by genuine belief in his talk of blood purity, and the reclaiming of what they saw as their rightful place in the world. Others drawn simply by ambition, by the promise of power and protection that came with standing close to a man whose influence was clearly, unmistakably growing. He recruited among the disillusioned as readily as among the fanatical, finding easy purchase with wizards who had grown resentful of a ministry they saw as weak, indecisive, and too willing to bend toward compromise with the Muggle world, and with those born outside the old magical families. Those who joined him did not simply pledge loyalty with a handshake or a quiet word. Each of them, in time, received a mark, burned into the skin of their forearm in the shape of a skull with a serpent issuing from its mouth like a tongue. This was the Dark Mark, and it was far more than an emblem of membership. It was a summons, a living thread of dark magic that connected each of his followers back to him, so that with a thought and a touch of his own mark, he could call any of them to his side no matter where in the world they stood. To wear it was to surrender a piece of one's own freedom, to become permanently and irrevocably reachable by him. And yet those who received it wore it, in those early years, with something closer to pride than fear, a badge that marked them as chosen among the faithful. By the time the 1970s had properly begun, Voldemort's following had grown from a handful of admiring young pure bloods into something that could fairly be called an organization, secretive and disciplined, bound together by ideology, ambition, and the ever-present pull of the mark on their arms. His philosophy had sharpened alongside his numbers, hardening from vague talk of tradition and heritage into an open doctrine of blood purity and dominance. The conviction that wizards of pure descent were meant to rule, that Muggle-borns and Muggles alike were obstacles to be swept from the path, and that the current order of the Ministry of Magic was a corruption waiting to be torn down and rebuilt in his image. Those who followed him called themselves, and were soon called by others, the Death Eaters, a name that would come to be spoken across magical Britain with a hush of genuine dread. What had begun as private conversations in comfortable drawing rooms was now something else entirely. A gathering storm with a name, a symbol, and a leader who had spent his whole life learning exactly how to make himself feared and obeyed in equal measure. Stick around for Chapter 11, The First Wizarding War, where we'll uncover how that storm finally broke over magical Britain, and how an order of witches and wizards under Albus Dumbledore's guidance rose to stand against it in the darkening years that followed. By the time the 1970s had settled fully over magical Britain, the quiet gathering of followers that had once unfolded behind closed doors and in hushed drawing rooms had become something the whole wizarding world could feel, even if few dared speak of it aloud. That descent into open conflict is the story told in Chapter 11, The First Wizarding War, and it is a story less about grand battles fought in daylight than about a slow, creeping dread that settled over ordinary wizarding life, a fear that grew heavier with each passing season. Families who had once felt entirely safe within their own homes began to feel otherwise. Wizards and witches who spoke too openly against the philosophy of blood purity, or who simply had the misfortune of being born to non-magical parents, began to vanish without warning, their absences discovered only when owls went unanswered and letters came back undelivered. The Death Eaters moved carefully and secretly in these years, striking and then dissolving back into ordinary life before the Ministry of Magic could ever quite catch hold of them. And this pattern of sudden disappearance followed by silence became, in its own way, more frightening than open violence might have been. A missing person left behind an absence that could stretch on forever, an uncertainty that gnawed at the families and friends left waiting for news that all too often never came. The ministry, for its part, struggled to respond with any real coherence. Its officials found themselves outmaneuvered again and again by an enemy who did not fight by the old rules, who used fear itself as a weapon nearly as effectively as any spell, and who counted among his followers men and women with respected family names and positions of quiet influence, making it difficult to know, in any given room, who might secretly be loyal to the other side. It was a war fought as much in whispers and suspicion as in open confrontation, and that uncertainty, the not knowing who could be trusted, proved to be one of Voldemort's most effective weapons of all. Against this rising tide, it fell to Albus Dumbledore, already regarded as one of the greatest wizards of the age, to gather together those willing to resist. He drew around him a small and determined circle of witches and wizards, men and women who believed that the values of tolerance and fairness that Voldemort so despised were worth defending, whatever the cost. This resistance came to be known as the Order of the Phoenix, named for the same magnificent bird that had long been Dumbledore's companion, a creature of renewal and quiet hope, even in the darkest hours. The Order operated in secret, much as its enemies did, meeting in guarded locations, sharing information carefully, working to protect those most at risk, and to stand in the way of the Death Eaters wherever they could be found and confronted. The years that followed brought a long, grinding series of confrontations, some small and quiet, others larger and more costly, though none of it unfolded with the neatness of a story told after the fact. Order members and Death Eaters crossed paths in shadowed streets and lonely countryside manors, in duels that were as much about survival as about victory, and the losses on both sides mounted slowly, painfully, across those years. Families lost sons and daughters, friends lost friends, and the wizarding community as a whole began to live with a low, constant hum of anxiety beneath even its most ordinary days, a sense that safety could no longer quite be taken for granted the way it once had been. Voldemort, meanwhile, seemed only to grow stronger as the conflict wore on. His numbers swelled, his reach extended further into the structures of wizarding society, and there were long stretches during these years when it felt to many, even to some within the Order itself, that his eventual triumph was less a possibility than an inevitability. He moved through this period with the calm, patient confidence of a man who believed he had already seen the shape of the future, and that the future belonged entirely to him. Entire families aligned themselves with him out of genuine belief, others out of simple fear of what might happen to those who did not. And the line between the two motivations grew harder and harder to see from the outside. And yet, even at the height of this creeping darkness, something remained that Voldemort had never quite learned to account for. A quiet and stubborn resistance that refused to give way no matter how heavy the losses became, held together by Dumbledore's steady guidance and by the simple, ordinary courage of people who continued to choose to stand against him. It was into this atmosphere of dread and defiance alike that a piece of information would soon arrive, one small and half-overheard fragment of prophecy that would, in time, reshape the entire course of the war and fix Voldemort's gaze upon a family he had never before had any particular reason to notice. Up next, in Chapter 12, The Prophecy in the Hog's Head, we'll uncover how those few whispered words, spoken above a dim and quiet inn, set in motion the events that would change everything. In the midst of a war that seemed, to many, to be tilting steadily toward Voldemort's favor, a single quiet meeting in an unremarkable room above a small and shabby inn would come to matter more than almost any battle fought across those long, fearful years. That meeting, and everything that unfolded from it, is the heart of Chapter 12, The Prophecy in the Hog's Head, and it begins not with confrontation or spellwork, but with a job interview not so different in shape from the one Voldemort himself had once sat through and failed. The inn in question was the Hog's Head, a dim and rather neglected establishment tucked into the village of Hogsmeade, far less polished than its more famous neighbor down the lane, but valued by those who preferred their conversations kept private and their comings and goings unremarked upon. It was there that Albus Dumbledore agreed to meet with a witch named Sybil Trelawney, who had come seeking a teaching position at Hogwarts in the subject of divination, a woman whose family name carried some faint echo of gifted seers from generations past, though she herself had shown little evidence of any particular talent in the ordinary course of conversation. Dumbledore, ever courteous even when unconvinced, listened patiently as she spoke, and found himself, if he was honest, not greatly impressed by what he heard. But something changed in the small upstairs room as their meeting drew toward its close. Sybil Trelawney's voice altered, deepening and roughening into something that no longer sounded quite like her own, her eyes losing their usual unfocused vagueness and taking on instead a strange, distant clarity. In that altered voice, she spoke words that seemed to rise from somewhere far beyond herself, a prophecy foretelling the coming of one with the power to defeat the Dark Lord, a child who would be born as the 7th month died, to parents who had already thrice defied Voldemort himself. The prophecy continued further still, speaking of a mark that this child would carry, and of a choice that the Dark Lord himself would one day be forced to make regarding him. And then, as suddenly as it had come, the strange voice faded, and Sybil Trelawney returned to herself with no memory at all of what had just passed through her. Unbeknownst to either of them, this private moment had not been entirely private. Severus Snape, still young and only newly drawn into Voldemort's circle of followers, had been listening at the door of the inn that night, sent to gather what information he could from a meeting he did not fully understand the purpose of. He caught the opening portion of the prophecy, the part concerning a child born at the end of July, with the power to defeat the Dark Lord, before the inn's own staff, alert to an eavesdropper lingering where he ought not to have been, discovered him and removed him from the premises before he could hear the rest. He came away from that night with only a fragment of the whole, and it was that fragment, incomplete and unfinished, that he carried back and eventually passed along to the man he served. When word of the prophecy reached Voldemort, he received it not as a curiosity, but as a warning demanding immediate and careful thought. He turned the words over with the same sharp, methodical mind that had once let a young orphan piece together his own hidden ancestry from scraps of old records, and he began to consider who this foretold child might be. 2 families within the wizarding world had, in recent months, given birth to sons at the very end of July, both of them born to parents who had openly defied him during the escalating conflict of those years. One was a boy named Neville Longbottom, born to a respected and combative family devoted to the Order's cause. The other was a boy named Harry Potter, born to James and Lily Potter, a couple who had likewise stood firmly and visibly against him. The prophecy, in the fragment Voldemort possessed, offered no clear way to choose between them, and yet he found himself drawn, for reasons that would only later be understood to matter a great deal, toward the Potter family rather than the Longbottoms. Perhaps it was something in the shared heritage he sensed between himself and the boy who would become his chosen target, a kinship neither of them yet understood. Or perhaps it was simply the restless certainty of a man who had spent his whole life believing that when he made a choice, he made the right one. Whatever the reasoning behind it, the decision settled into something fixed and immovable in his mind. And from that point onward, the Potter family, a young couple with an infant son not yet even walking, became the focus of the Dark Lord's full and undivided attention. Neither James nor Lily Potter yet knew the shape of the danger now gathering around their small family. nor could they have guessed how closely the fate of the entire wizarding world had come to rest upon their quiet cottage and the small child sleeping inside it. Stick around for Chapter 13, The Night at Godric's Hollow, where we'll uncover how that gathering danger finally arrived at their door, and how one impossible night would change the course of the war and the fate of the boy at its center forever. By the autumn of 1981, a prophecy had been spoken, overheard in fragments, and carried like a splinter into the mind of a man who could not bear the thought of anyone rising to challenge him. He had turned the words over and over until they pointed, in his own reckoning, toward a single house in a single village, and toward a child not yet 2 years old. That story, the last of the wilderness before everything changed, comes to its quiet and terrible close in Chapter 13, The Night at Godric's Hollow. Godric's Hollow was a small village then, the kind of place where cottages leaned companionably toward one another along narrow lanes, where a church bell could be heard from nearly every garden, and where the graveyard held names that stretched back centuries into the soil. It was early evening on the 31st of October, the last night of October, the night the Muggle world called Halloween and dressed its children in costumes to knock on doors for sweets. Inside one particular cottage near the heart of the village, warm light spilled from the windows onto a lawn scattered with fallen leaves. A young family lived there in hiding, protected by magic meant to keep them safe from a war that had reached nearly every corner of the wizarding world. James Potter and his wife Lily had gone into hiding with their son, a baby not yet old enough to walk more than a few unsteady steps, and they had trusted their safety to a charm that could make a house invisible to any enemy, so long as the one person who knew its location kept that secret close. That protection depended entirely on trust, and it was trust that had quietly, secretly been broken. The friend chosen to guard their secret had turned, in the fear and pressure of that long war, and had carried the location of the cottage to the very person the Potters had been hiding from. It is a small and sorrowful thing to say aloud, even now, that betrayal wearing a familiar face can undo in a moment what love and magic spent months trying to protect. The friend's name was Peter Pettigrew, and though the full weight of what he did would not be understood by the wider wizarding world for years to come, on that October night, his choice opened the door that should have stayed forever closed. As darkness settled fully over the village and the lane outside grew still, a cloaked figure arrived at the garden gate. He did not linger. He had come with a single purpose, certain in his own mind that this house held the ending of the only story that frightened him, the story in which he might one day be equaled or undone. He crossed the garden without hesitation and reached the front door, and with a small and almost gentle motion of his wand, the door was no longer a barrier at all. Inside, James Potter heard the sound of it giving way. In the space of a heartbeat, understanding what was happening and who must be outside, he turned to his wife and told her, with as much calm as a person can summon in such a moment, to take their son and run, that he would hold the stairs for as long as he possibly could. It is not necessary, and it would serve no comfort, to dwell long on what happened next in that narrow hallway. What matters, what deserves to be remembered above all else, is that James Potter met the danger at the bottom of the stairs not because he believed he could win, but because it bought his wife and child the only thing he had left to give them, a handful of extra seconds. He did not run. He stood between his family and the door, and in that stillness there was more courage than fear ever manages to record. Upstairs, Lily Potter had only moments. She could have fled through a window, could perhaps have saved herself alone, but she did not so much as consider it. She placed herself between the crib and the door, her son behind her, and when the footsteps reached the top of the stairs, she did not step aside. She was offered, in that final exchange, a strange and almost formal kind of mercy, a chance to move out of the way and be spared, because the visitor's purpose that night was fixed entirely on the child. She refused, again and again, with nothing but her voice and her body between her son and the wand pointed past her. It was not defiance born of anger. It was simply love, whole and complete and entirely unwilling to yield, the oldest kind of magic there is. Older by far than any spell taught at any school. And when the curse came, green light filling that small nursery for an instant before the room went dark and silent, it took her from her son's side, but it did not take what she had given him. That protection, woven from a mother's last act, settled invisibly over the crib and over the child within it, and it would remain there long after the light had faded. The man in the cloak turned then to the crib itself, to a child barely more than a baby, dark-haired and green-eyed, watching him with the plain, unafraid curiosity that very young children often show towards strangers, having no way yet to understand danger. He raised his wand a final time and spoke the same curse that had taken so many others in the long years of his campaign, the curse that had never once failed him. This time, it did not do what he expected. The spell met something in that room it could not overcome, an old and quiet magic left behind by a mother's sacrifice, and rather than striking the child, it turned back upon the one who had cast it. The cottage shook. Part of the roof and an upper wall gave way in a soft collapse of plaster and timber and settling dust, and where a moment before a powerful and feared wizard had stood, there was, quite suddenly, nothing solid left at all. His body could not survive what had happened. It was undone entirely, scattered beyond any physical form, leaving behind only his cloak, some settling debris, and a silence that felt enormous after so much violence. The child in the crib was left with nothing more than a thin cut on his forehead, shaped like a lightning bolt, already beginning to close. He would carry that mark for the rest of his life, a quiet signature of the night his mother's love proved stronger than the darkest magic anyone had yet devised. He began, after a moment, to cry, the ordinary cry of a baby who did not understand what had happened. Only that the room was cold and strange, and his mother was not lifting him the way she always did. And somewhere beyond the ruined nursery, beyond the broken roof and the settling dust, something thin and formless fled into the night. It was not death, not entirely, though it was closer to death than to any kind of life a person could recognize. It was a fragment, a remnant, diminished almost beyond imagining, no longer a man in any way that mattered. Barely even a shadow of the will that had walked through that garden gate such a short time before. It had nowhere to go, and no strength left to go there with, and it drifted away from Godric's hollow into the dark countryside, carrying nothing but the barest ember of the intention that had once made it whole. Up next, in Chapter 14, A Shadow Without a Body, we'll uncover where that fading remnant went in the long, quiet years that followed, and how something so diminished began, slowly and patiently, to search for a way back into the world. In the ruins of that small nursery at Godric's Hollow, something had survived that ought, by every reasonable measure, to have been ended entirely. It was not a body any longer, and it was scarcely even a mind in any way the word usually means, but it endured, thin and formless and afraid, and its long and lonely struggle to exist again is where we pick up the thread in Chapter 14. A shadow without a body. For a wizard who had spent his whole life terrified of dying, being reduced to something less than alive was its own particular horror. What fled that cottage was closer to vapor than to flesh, a consciousness without a shape to hold it, unable to be seen by ordinary eyes and unable to touch or hold or speak in any way that others could perceive. It could not simply rest and recover the way an injured person might. It had no strength to draw on, no wand, no allies who yet knew it was still, in some fragile sense, present in the world at all. Most who had followed it, the witches and wizards who had sworn themselves to its cause, believed on that October night that their leader was gone for good. And in the chaos and relief that swept the wizarding world afterward, no one thought to search the quiet places where a shattered will might have gone to hide. It drifted, at first, without any clear direction, seeking only whatever might sustain it in the barest sense. The forests of the world offered a kind of refuge that towns and cities could not, places far from human eyes where something so weakened could exist unnoticed. In time, it made its way to the wilder and more remote reaches of Europe, and it was in the dense, ancient forests of Albania that it settled for the greater part of those long years, hidden among trees that had stood for centuries and had no interest in what passed beneath their branches. Existing in that state meant relying on creatures that could not refuse it, and so it learned to slip inside the minds of small animals, snakes and birds, and other quiet forest dwellers, borrowing their bodies for a time the way a traveler might borrow a coat against the cold. It was a thin and joyless existence, offering no comfort, no real strength, only the barest continuation of something that had once commanded fear across an entire country. Each creature it inhabited eventually weakened and had to be abandoned for another, and in this slow and patient way, season after season, year after year, it endured, waiting for the world to forget about it entirely, which in large part it did. 13 years is a long time to be nearly nothing, and there is a particular kind of quiet sorrow, even for a figure remembered for cruelty, in imagining that long stretch of near dissolution, alone in the dark of a foreign forest, waiting. Word of what remained reached only a small handful of the old followers, whispers among those who had not entirely given up, believing their leader might return. Most had scattered, some imprisoned, some pretending publicly that they had never truly supported him at all. But there were always a few who kept listening for any sign, and it was through people like these that the weakened remnant eventually found a way to begin, however slowly, rebuilding some fragment of purpose. A young man crossed its path during those wilderness years, a talented but timid wizard by the name of Quirinus Quirrell, who had gone traveling in search of knowledge and adventure, the kind of gentle scholarly curiosity that so often leads a person somewhere they never expected. Exactly how their paths crossed in that remote part of the world remains something of a private mystery, known only to the two of them. But by the time Quirrell returned to Britain to take up a teaching post, he was no longer entirely alone inside his own mind. The remnant had found, in this quiet and nervous young professor, a vessel it could use, and it settled itself beneath a purple turban Quirrell wore from that point onward, hidden at the back of his head where no student or colleague thought to look. It was an uncomfortable and unequal arrangement for Quirrell, whose stammering nervousness around students and colleagues alike concealed a far heavier burden than anyone around him guessed. Slowly, cautiously, using Quirrell as both disguise and instrument, the weakened spirit began searching for a way to restore itself fully, to become something more than a passenger hiding beneath fabric and hair. That search led, in the school year of 1991 to 1992, to Hogwarts itself, where an object of extraordinary power was rumored to be hidden deep beneath the castle. It was called the Philosopher's Stone, said to grant its bearer the elixir of life, and, with it, something very close to the endless existence that had been so violently taken away 13 years before. Quirrell, guided and driven by the presence sharing his body, worked throughout that year to uncover the stone's hiding place, moving quietly through the castle's older and stranger corners while maintaining, in his lessons, the same anxious and forgettable manner that had always kept anyone from suspecting him. It was in that same year that an 11-year-old boy arrived at Hogwarts for the first time, a boy with dark, untidy hair and a thin scar shaped like a lightning bolt. The very child who had been left behind in that ruined nursery so many years before. Neither of them, master nor student, fully understood yet how tightly their two stories were bound together. But by the final weeks of that school year, their paths crossed at last, deep beneath the castle, in a chamber built to guard the stone from anyone who might seek it. What happened there was brief and, in the end, gentle in its resolution, whatever fear it carried in the moment. Quirrell, urged on by the presence that controlled him, reached for the boy, and found that the same old protection woven into him on the night his mother died had not faded in the years between, and could not be touched without cost. The confrontation ended with Quirrell's collapse, his body unable to bear what had been asked of it, and with his death that night, quiet and without suffering, the fragile plan to seize the stone came to nothing. The remnant that had used him fled once more, formless and weakened again, driven back out into hiding, its hope of an easy road to strength undone for a second time. Up next in Chapter 15, The Diary's Whisper, we'll uncover how a very different kind of trap, one made of ink and parchment rather than stone or turban, found its way into the hands of a young girl at Hogwarts, and how an old, familiar voice began speaking to her from its pages. After the failure beneath Hogwarts and the loss of the vessel he had used for so many careful months, the diminished spirit that had once been a powerful wizard withdrew again into hiding, patient in the way that only something with nothing but time can be patient. He had other plans laid long before that year, other small pieces of himself left scattered and waiting in the world, and one of those pieces was about to find its way, quite by accident, into a young girl's school trunk. That story begins in Chapter 15, The Diary's Whisper. The object in question was a plain black diary, unremarkable to look at, its leather cover worn soft with age, the kind of thing that might sit unnoticed on a shelf for years. It had been kept safe for a long time, tucked away and largely forgotten, until it resurfaced in the summer before the school year of 1992 to 93, finding its way into the belongings of the Weasley family without any of them quite realizing what they now possessed. Among that family's children was a girl named Ginny, the youngest and the only daughter, who had grown up idolizing her older brothers and hearing endless stories about the famous school she had not yet been old enough to attend. When the diary came into her hands that summer, she did what any lonely, imaginative child might do with a blank book. She began, quite innocently, to write in it. What she could not have known was that the diary was not blank in the way it appeared. It held within it a kind of preserved memory, a fragment of a much younger version of the wizard, who had once been a brilliant and charming student at Hogwarts himself, decades earlier. This was one of the darkest secrets the diary carried, though it is not one this story needs to dwell on in any technical sense, only to say that a piece of that old wizard's younger self had been folded carefully into its pages, waiting for someone to open them and begin writing back. And write back it did. When Ginny confided her small worries in its pages, homesickness, nerves about starting a new school, the ordinary uncertainties of an 11-year-old finding her footing among 4 older brothers and their easy confidence, the diary answered her. Words appeared on the page in a neat, careful hand, as though someone were listening on the other side, someone patient and endlessly interested in everything she had to say. For a girl who sometimes felt overlooked in a large and loving but very full household, having something that answered back, that never grew tired of her, that made her feel truly seen, was a quiet and powerful comfort. She began writing to it often, then daily, sharing thoughts she might have hesitated to share with anyone else, and the diary listened and reassured her, and slowly, so slowly she never noticed it happening, began to lean on her in turn. It is a gentle and sorrowful thing to imagine, a kind presence turning out to be something else entirely, and that is exactly what unfolded over the course of that school year, quietly and out of sight of the people who loved her most. The diary's patience was not kindness for its own sake. It was drawing on something from her, borrowing her energy and her trust the way a plant draws water from soil, growing stronger with every entry she wrote while she herself grew paler, more tired, more prone to long silences and lost hours she could not account for. She began to seem unlike herself to those who knew her, distracted and drawn, though no one around her yet understood why. All the while, strange and frightening events had begun happening around the school, whispered about in the corridors, and though Ginny had no memory of any part in them, a small and troubled feeling had begun to settle over her. A fear she could not quite name or explain, even to herself. By the end of that year, the truth had become impossible to keep hidden any longer. The diary had been using Ginny, gently and completely, as a kind of conduit, and through her it had managed to reopen an ancient and long-sealed chamber beneath the school, one first opened decades before by that same young wizard when he too had been a Hogwarts student. The details of that old chamber and the creature said to guard it belong more properly to an earlier point in this story. But what matters here is that its reawakening frightened the entire school, and that Ginny, overwhelmed and unknowing, found herself carried down into its depths one evening, drawn there by the will that had been quietly borrowing her strength all year. It was Harry Potter, by then a second-year student himself, and already remembered across the wizarding world for surviving that night at Godric's Hollow, who went down after her. He made his way through cold stone passages far beneath the castle, following the sound of a voice only he could understand in that ancient, hissing language of serpents, until he reached a great chamber lit by torches, and found Ginny lying pale and still upon the floor, seemingly beyond waking. Beside her, waiting calmly as though he had all the time in the world, stood the memory the diary had preserved, a handsome, dark-haired young man of about 16, who introduced himself with easy charm and told Harry, in a slow and unhurried way, the story of who he truly was and what he had once been and what he intended still to become. What followed was quiet and strange rather than loud, a battle fought as much in nerve and understanding as in spellwork. Harry, refusing to be shaken by the young man's cold confidence, called upon help that arrived just in time, and in the moments that followed, the diary itself, the true source of the memory's continued presence, was pierced through by a long curved fang taken from the very creature that had been guarding the chamber. Ink, dark as blood, began to spill from its pages, and the handsome young memory let out a long, fading cry as it dissolved into nothing at all, the pages beneath Harry's hands turning ordinary and blank once more. Ginny stirred, opened her eyes, and slowly, tearfully, began to understand that whatever had been happening to her that year was finally, truly over. She was carried back up into the light and warmth of the school, shaken but safe, and in time surrounded by her family's relief and the quiet comfort of familiar halls. The frightened months she had endured began to soften into memory rather than fear. The diary that had caused so much harm was gone, destroyed completely, and with it, One small piece of the darkness that had been trying so patiently to return had been undone. Up next in Chapter 16, Blood, Bone, and Flesh, we'll uncover how, 2 years later, a very different kind of trap was laid. One that would lead a champion of Hogwarts through a maze and into a distant graveyard, where an old and waiting plan would finally, terribly, succeed. 2 more school years passed quietly at Hogwarts after the diary was destroyed. Years in which the frightened whispers of the Chamber of Secrets slowly faded into the ordinary rhythm of lessons and seasons. But far from the castle, patient and hidden, an old plan had never stopped moving forward. And in the school year of 1994 to 95, it finally found the opening it had been waiting for. That story unfolds now in Chapter 16, Blood, Bone, and Flesh. That year, Hogwarts had the rare honor of hosting the Triwizard Tournament, a grand and storied competition between 3 great schools of magic, each sending forward a single champion chosen by an enchanted goblet to compete in a series of demanding and dangerous tasks. Extraordinarily, that year the goblet produced not 3 names but 4, and the 4th was a 14-year-old Harry Potter, entered into the tournament by means no one could quite explain. Placed among competitors years older and far more experienced than himself. Alongside him, representing Hogwarts as its rightful champion, was a kind and well-liked older student named Cedric Diggory, admired across the school for his fairness and his easy, warm nature. The tournament unfolded across that year in 3 great tasks, each testing courage and skill in different ways, and through all of it, unseen by nearly everyone, careful hands were quietly arranging events behind the scenes. A trusted teacher at the school that year was not entirely what he seemed, and through small, patient interferences, he worked to guide Harry safely through each task, not out of kindness, but because a very old and very patient plan required that Harry survive long enough to reach the tournament's final moment. That final moment came in the 3rd task, a great and sprawling maze grown especially for the occasion, its hedges tall and shifting, hiding enchantments and creatures within its winding paths. Harry and Cedric found themselves near the maze's heart together, and rather than compete against one another in that last stretch, each having helped the other survive earlier dangers that night, they chose instead to reach the center as equals, agreeing to take hold of the tournament's cup together and share in whatever honor came with finishing first. But the cup was not simply a trophy that night. It had been quietly transformed into a portkey, an object enchanted to pull anyone touching it away to another place entirely. And this had been arranged deliberately, long before the maze ever opened its hedges to the champions. The instant their hands closed around it, both boys felt the familiar tug behind the navel that marks such travel, and the maze, the crowd, and all of Hogwarts vanished from around them. They landed instead in a dark, overgrown graveyard in a small village called Little Hangleton, surrounded by old headstones leaning at odd angles beneath a cold night sky. It was unfamiliar and unsettling, and before either boy could fully gather his bearings, a figure stepped forward out of the shadows near a great marble tomb, a small, hunched man whose nervous, twitching manner Harry recognized at once, though it took a moment longer to place him fully. It was the same friend who had once, long ago, betrayed the Potter family's trust, and who had spent the years since in hiding, still bound in service to the master he had helped restore to a fragment of life all those years before. His name was Peter Pettigrew, and that night, in that quiet graveyard, he had a final and terrible task of his own to perform. Cedric, sensing danger and wanting only to protect Harry, urged him to take hold of the cup and return to safety at once. In the moment that followed, a voice cold and thin ordered his death, and it happened quickly, without struggle or suffering prolonged. A single flash of green light in the dark, and then stillness. It is right to pause gently here and remember him, not for how his story ended, but for how he lived, warm and well-liked and fair-minded to the last. A young man who had done nothing in that graveyard but try to help a friend, and whose loss was felt across the wizarding world as a genuine and aching sorrow, mourned by family and school alike in the weeks that followed. Harry, bound now by ropes to the old headstone at the center of that graveyard, could only watch as Pettigrew moved forward to complete what he had come there to do. Nearby stood a large stone cauldron, and within it a ritual was carried out that night to restore, fully and completely, the body that had been lost 13 years earlier at Godric's Hollow. It is enough to say, gently and without dwelling on particulars that belong to darker corners of this story, that the ritual called upon three old and symbolic elements: something taken from the father, something taken unwillingly from the servant, and something given, under threat, from the enemy, spoken of in old magic simply as bone, flesh, and blood. Pettigrew's role in it cost him dearly, a sacrifice of his own that he made with visible anguish, and by the time the ritual drew to its close, steam rising from the cauldron into the cold night air, what climbed from within it was no longer a shadow or a borrowed vessel. It was a man again, tall and thin and pale, drawing his first true breath in over a decade. He dressed himself in dark robes brought for the purpose, and with a calm that was almost worse than any anger might have been, he called his followers to him. One by one, dark shapes appeared at the edges of the graveyard, drawn by the old mark upon their arms, kneeling before the master many of them had thought lost forever. He spoke to them at length that night, of loyalty rewarded and loyalty found wanting. And then, with the same cold ease, he turned his attention back to the boy bound to the headstone, the boy whose survival 13 years before had cost him so much. What followed was a brief and extraordinary duel, wands connecting in a rare and strange link of light that neither combatant had expected, filled with echoes of those who had died before, whose presence lent Harry just enough time and just enough courage to break free and seize the portkey once more. In an instant, the graveyard fell away, and Harry tumbled back into the light and noise of the Hogwarts grounds, Cedric's body held close beside him, carrying news that would soon shake the entire wizarding world out of the peace it had rested in for over a decade. Up next in Chapter 17, The Ministry Looks Away, we'll uncover how those in power chose, at first, not to believe what had happened in that graveyard, and how a season of quiet denial allowed an old danger to begin rebuilding itself in the shadows once again. A graveyard at Little Hangleton had witnessed a return that no one in the wider wizarding world yet wished to believe, and it was that disbelief, stubborn and fearful in equal measure, which shaped the year that followed. That story begins in Chapter 17, The Ministry Looks Away, and it opens not with darkness, but with denial. A quieter and in some ways sadder kind of danger. The danger of a world choosing comfort over truth. Through the autumn of 1995, the Ministry of Magic occupied itself not with defense, but with dismissal. Cornelius Fudge, the minister at the time, had built his career on stability and calm administration, and the thought that Lord Voldemort might have returned threatened everything he understood his role to be. Rather than face that possibility, Fudge chose to treat it as a rumor, then as a nuisance, then finally as something close to a conspiracy against his own office. Albus Dumbledore's warnings, delivered with the same patient clarity he had always shown, were met not with gratitude, but with suspicion. And slowly, quietly, the ministry began to treat the old headmaster and the young boy who had survived the graveyard as figures to be managed rather than trusted. The Daily Prophet, once a steady chronicle of magical life, began printing stories that painted Harry Potter as unstable and attention-seeking, and painted Dumbledore as an aging man clinging to influence he no longer deserved. It was a strange, uncomfortable season, one in which the greatest danger facing the wizarding world was not a curse or a monster, but a collective decision to look the other way. Into this uneasy quiet arrived a woman named Dolores Umbridge, sent to Hogwarts first as a ministry-appointed teacher of defense against the dark arts, and soon after granted powers that stretched far beyond any classroom. She dressed in soft pink and spoke in a voice that stayed light and pleasant, even when the things she said were anything but, and beneath that gentle exterior, she carried out her role with a rigid, joyless precision. Under her authority, real defensive magic was pushed aside in favor of theory read silently from textbooks, as though refusing to practice spells might somehow prevent the world from needing them. Students who spoke out of turn, who questioned her authority, or who simply repeated what Harry had told them about the graveyard, found themselves facing punishments that were quiet, personal, and deeply unfair. Toward the end of that school year, she was elevated further still, made Hogwarts High Inquisitor, and eventually Headmistress, a title she wore with visible satisfaction even as the castle around her grew colder and more watchful under her rule. It was a strange kind of tyranny, built not from spectacle, but from small daily cruelties, from rules multiplying like ivy across every wall, and the students of Hogwarts learned to move carefully through their own school, aware that the person meant to guide them had become, in her own quiet way, someone to fear. While the ministry busied itself denying what had happened and Umbridge tightened her grip on the school, Voldemort worked from the shadows with the same patience he had always shown, gathering his scattered followers back to his side and beginning, slowly and carefully, to rebuild the strength he had lost. He understood, better than almost anyone, the value of being underestimated, and he allowed the confusion and denial spreading through magical Britain to become his shelter, using the very disbelief that frustrated Dumbledore so deeply as cover for his own quiet preparations. Death Eaters, who had scattered after his fall, were drawn back one by one, some willingly, some through fear, and the network he had once commanded began, thread by careful thread, to knit itself together again. It was during this same uneasy year that Voldemort's attention turned towards something Dumbledore had long kept guarded, a prophecy spoken years before in a room above a small Hogsmeade pub, the very words that had once led Voldemort to Godric's Hollow in the first place. Believing that hearing the prophecy in full might finally reveal the answer to defeating the boy who had already thwarted him more than once, Voldemort worked to lure Harry toward the Ministry of Magic itself, into the deep, silent halls of the Department of Mysteries, where such prophecies were kept sealed in shelves of soft, glowing glass. Harry, believing a vision he had seen to be true, gathered a small group of loyal friends and made his way there in secret, only to find himself walking directly into a trap set for exactly that purpose. What followed was a battle unlike any the young witches and wizards involved had yet faced, fought among towering shelves and strange, dreamlike rooms deep beneath the ministry, wandlight flashing between rows of prophecies as Death Eaters closed in around a small circle of friends who refused to abandon one another. In the confusion of that battle, the prophecy orb that had drawn them all there shattered, its secret lost to the air the moment it left Harry's hand, meaning that whatever it had once promised now existed only in the memory of the two people who had heard it spoken long ago. And in the midst of that same chaos, members of the Order of the Phoenix arrived to help, drawn by Dumbledore's own warning, and among them came Sirius Black, Harry's godfather, moving through the battle with the same fierce loyalty he had always carried for the boy he loved as his own. It was there, in that strange underground chamber, that Sirius fell, struck during a duel and passing beyond a shimmering veiled archway that stood at the heart of the room, gone gently and suddenly, all at once, leaving behind a silence that settled over Harry like a heavy, unfamiliar cold. There was no cruelty in how the story chooses to remember him, only warmth, the warmth of a man who had spent so much of his life waiting to be free, who had found in his godson a piece of the family he had lost, and who left this world still reaching toward the people he loved. His laughter, his loyalty, and his fierce protective love for Harry remained long after that night. A quiet kind of light that the darkness of that year could not entirely extinguish. Dumbledore arrived soon after, and in the confrontation that followed, he faced Voldemort directly for the first time since his return, the two of them matching power against power in the atrium of the Ministry itself, watched by stone statues and startled officials who could no longer deny what stood before them. Voldemort escaped that night, but the truth could not be hidden any longer, and Cornelius Fudge, forced at last to see what he had refused to acknowledge for so long, understood that his season of denial had ended. The wizarding world woke that summer to a truth it could no longer look away from, and with that truth came the slow, uneasy realization that a war once thought finished had in fact only been sleeping. Up next in Chapter 18, The Death of Dumbledore and the Takeover, we'll uncover how the year that followed brought Voldemort's shadow closer to the very heart of the wizarding world than it had ever reached before, and how a single night atop a familiar tower would change the course of the story forever. With the truth of his return finally acknowledged across magical Britain, Voldemort no longer needed to hide in whispers and denial, and the year that followed became one of steady, creeping conquest. That story belongs to Chapter 18, The Death of Dumbledore and the Takeover, and it begins in the autumn of 1996, with a wizarding world newly aware of its danger, but still desperately unprepared to face it. Through that year, Voldemort worked with the same patient calculation that had defined every stage of his rise, reaching not through open battle, but through influence, fear, and quiet infiltration. His followers spread through the Ministry of Magic itself, some through blackmail, some through the dark magic of Imperius, and some simply through willing loyalty offered in hope of reward or safety. Families like the Malfoys, once proud and untouchable, found themselves bound tightly to his service, their loyalty no longer a matter of choice but of survival, and even within Hogwarts itself, his reach extended further than anyone imagined, aided by circumstances that would not become fully clear until much later. Draco Malfoy, still a student, carried a heavy and frightening task that year, one placed upon his young shoulders by Voldemort himself, a task meant as much to punish the Malfoy family for past failure as to test the boy's loyalty. And it hung over him through those months like a shadow no classroom could shield him from. All of this unfolded beneath the watchful, weary eyes of Albus Dumbledore, who spent that year working closely with Harry, sharing with him, in quiet meetings held mostly in the headmaster's own study, memories and insights into Voldemort's past, the same past that reached back to an orphanage in London and a ring found in a ruined stone cottage. Dumbledore understood, more clearly than anyone, that defeating Voldemort would require more than raw power, and he spent his final months preparing Harry not with despair, but with knowledge, treating the boy less as a student to be protected, and more as a young man who deserved to understand the shape of the danger he faced. It was in the late spring of that year, after a difficult and dangerous journey undertaken together to retrieve something Dumbledore believed important to Voldemort's downfall, that the headmaster returned to Hogwarts weakened and unwell, his strength diminished by what the journey had cost him. That same night, the castle's defenses were breached, not through force, but through the quiet task Draco Malfoy had been given, and Death Eaters made their way into the school under cover of darkness. Atop the astronomy tower, high above the grounds where he had walked for so many decades, Dumbledore found himself facing not only danger, but a moment that called for something far more complicated than a duel. What happened next has been told and retold many times, always with the same quiet reverence, for it was not a story of simple violence, but one of sacrifice, of loyalty so deeply hidden that even those closest to Dumbledore did not fully understand it until long afterward. Severus Snape, a man whose true allegiance had remained a careful secret for nearly 2 decades, was present on the tower that night, and it was he who carried out the act that ended Dumbledore's life. A moment arranged in advance between the two of them, born from a promise made in trust rather than betrayal. Though the wizarding world would not come to understand this for a long while yet. Dumbledore's final moments were calm, deliberate, and free of fear, a headmaster choosing, even at the very end, to protect the people around him and to trust in a plan far larger than what anyone watching could see. He fell from the tower gently into the night, and the school that had been his home for so long fell silent beneath him, a silence that seemed to settle over every corridor and portrait at once. The days that followed brought a grief unlike anything Hogwarts had known, a hush that moved through the castle as students and staff alike absorbed the loss of a man who had, for so many of them, represented safety itself. Yet even amid that sorrow, there was a quiet dignity in how he was remembered, a recognition that his life, and even the manner of his passing, had been shaped entirely by his own choices, made with clear eyes and steady purpose. Snape's role in that night would remain, for a long while, a mystery clouded in suspicion and anger, his true loyalties hidden beneath the weight of what he had done, and he vanished from the castle that same night to take up a new position at Voldemort's side, stepping fully into a role that would place him, for the rest of the war, at the very center of events without anyone yet understanding why. With Dumbledore gone and Hogwarts without its guiding light, the last real resistance within the Ministry of Magic crumbled soon after. Voldemort's influence, already spread wide through blackmail and fear, tightened into something closer to full control, with loyal officials replaced by his own followers, and the machinery of government turned quietly but completely toward his purposes. The takeover was not announced with grand declarations, but arrived instead through a slow, bureaucratic transformation, new policies, new appointments, and a creeping sense among ordinary witches and wizards that something fundamental had shifted beneath their feet. It was against this darkening backdrop that a wedding took place at the Burrow, the home of the Weasley family, a bright and joyful gathering meant to celebrate love and continuity even as shadows lengthened around the wizarding world. Guests danced beneath strings of golden light, and for a few precious hours, warmth and laughter pushed back against the growing dread that had settled over everyone in attendance. But that peace did not last. News arrived abruptly that the ministry had fallen fully into Voldemort's control, carried by a trembling messenger whose arrival scattered the celebration into panic, and the wedding dissolved into a swirl of fleeing guests and protective spells cast in haste against the night. In the confusion that followed, Harry, Ron, and Hermione made the choice that would define the year ahead of them, slipping away from the wedding and from the safety of familiar places entirely, carrying with them only the task Dumbledore had entrusted to Harry before his death, a mission whose full weight they were only beginning to understand. They stepped out into a wizarding world now openly ruled by fear, choosing to disappear into hiding rather than wait to be found. Three young friends walking away from everything comfortable in pursuit of something none of them could yet be certain how to finish. Up next, in Chapter 19, The Long Hunt, we'll uncover how those months of hiding tested their courage and their friendship in equal measure, and how, far from any classroom or castle, Voldemort's own path drew closer to a wand of extraordinary legend resting quietly in a tomb. Three young friends walked away from a broken wedding and into a wizarding world that no longer felt safe for any of them, carrying a task whose scope they were only beginning to understand. That story unfolds across Chapter 19, The Long Hunt, a season stretched thin across the autumn, winter, and early spring of 1997 into 1998, and it is best remembered not as a story of despair, but as one of quiet endurance, carried forward by loyalty and by love for one another. Harry, Ron, and Hermione spent those months moving from place to place, sleeping in a small, enchanted tent, pitched in forests, on hillsides, and in quiet corners of the countryside, far from anyone who might recognize them. Hermione, ever prepared, had planned for this long before it began, filling a small, beaded bag with everything they might need, and it was her foresight, along with Ron's steady humor and Harry's quiet determination, that carried them through the hardest stretches of that year. There were cold nights and hungry mornings, stretches of silence between them born from exhaustion and fear rather than anger, and long days spent simply waiting, watching, and trying to piece together a path forward with little more than fragments of guidance left behind by Dumbledore. Yet even in those difficult months, warmth found its way through, in shared meals cooked over small fires, in old records played softly on a wireless radio, in the simple comfort of three friends who had chosen, again and again, not to face the world alone. Their task, though never explained in great procedural detail here, for that story belongs to another telling entirely, centered on locating and destroying the remaining fragments of Voldemort's shattered soul, the same dark protections he had created many years before in his relentless pursuit of immortality. Piece by piece, through danger and through patience, they narrowed the distance between themselves and the completion of Dumbledore's final wish, each discovery drawing them closer to a confrontation none of them could yet fully picture. While the trio moved quietly through forests and hidden places, Voldemort's path that same year carried him toward something he had wanted for a very long time, an object spoken of in old stories as the most powerful wand ever made. Believing that ultimate victory required not just strength, but mastery over death itself, he became consumed with securing what was known as the Elder Wand, a weapon of legend said to answer only to whoever had won it through defeat of its previous master. His search led him, in the quiet hours of night, to Hogwarts itself and to the tomb of Albus Dumbledore, resting peacefully on the grounds where he had spent so much of his life. There, in a moment stripped of ceremony or hesitation, Voldemort opened that tomb and took the wand from Dumbledore's still hands, certain that in doing so he had finally claimed the one advantage that would make him unstoppable. What he did not yet understand, and would not understand until the very end of his story, was that such a wand's loyalty could never simply be taken, it had to be won. And the true nature of that old magic was far more particular than even he, in all his study, had grasped. That same stretch of the war brought with it one of its gentlest and most quietly devastating losses, the death of Severus Snape, a man whose loyalties had been misunderstood by nearly everyone around him for the better part of 2 decades. Since that night atop the Astronomy Tower, Snape had walked a lonely and dangerous path at Voldemort's side, trusted enough to remain close, yet never fully believed, his every action watched and questioned by the very side he had appeared to join. As the war drew toward its final chapter, Voldemort, growing ever more suspicious of the wand's loyalty and the reasons it might not be answering to him as expected, turned against Snape in a moment shaped by cold calculation rather than open conflict. It was there that Snape's life came to its end, quiet and full of a sorrow that only later would be fully understood. For in his final moments, rather than despair, he offered up the truth he had carried in silence for so many years, memories entrusted gently to Harry that revealed a loyalty to Dumbledore and to Harry's mother Lily that had never once wavered beneath the surface of everything the world believed about him. It was a passing marked not by cruelty in how it is remembered, but by a deep and abiding dignity. The quiet unveiling of a man who had spent his whole life loving in secret and protecting from the shadows, asking for nothing in return but that his purpose finally be understood. As the war moved toward its final weeks, something else had begun to shift within Voldemort himself, subtle at first, then increasingly difficult to ignore. The confidence that had carried him through his long rise, the certainty that victory was simply a matter of time and preparation, had begun to curdle into something more brittle underneath. He grew more isolated from those who served him, trusting fewer people with fewer truths, doubting even his most loyal followers, and the closeness he had once cultivated among his Death Eaters thinned into something colder and more transactional. He had spent his whole life avoiding the vulnerability of trust, and now, with victory seemingly so near, that same old fear crept back in, whispering that even his own wand, even his own careful plans, might not be entirely his to control. It was the paranoia of a man who had built an empire on the foundation of never truly being known by anyone, and who now, standing at the edge of what he believed would be final victory, found himself more alone than he had been in a very long time. Far away, in a forest clearing as the year turned toward May, Harry, Ron, and Hermione felt that same tension building in the world around them, a sense that the long months of searching, hiding, and enduring were finally drawing to their close. The next chapter of their journey would not be found in quiet hiding places any longer, but within the walls of the castle that had once been the safest place any of them had known. Up next, in Chapter 20, The Final Duel, we'll uncover how the halls of Hogwarts became the site of the last great battle of the war, and how one final walk into the Forbidden Forest would change everything that came after. Chapter 20. The Final Duel. The night that carried the wizarding world from the 1st of May into the 2nd of May, 1998, would be remembered forever as the night the war came home to Hogwarts. The castle that had sheltered generations of students, the same castle where an orphaned boy named Tom Riddle had once felt, for the first time in his life, that he belonged somewhere, now stood surrounded by the army he had built. Its windows glowed against the darkness, its old stones trembled under the weight of spellfire, and inside its walls, teachers and students, parents and shopkeepers, house elves and ghosts, all stood together in defense of the only home many of them had ever truly known. Voldemort himself waited beyond the grounds, at first in the Shrieking Shack, and later at the edge of the Forbidden Forest, directing the battle from a distance, certain that the night would end with the castle kneeling before him. But the night was not unfolding as he believed. Deep inside the castle, Harry Potter had learned the last and heaviest truth of the war, the truth that Dumbledore had guarded until the very end, and that Severus Snape had delivered with his final breath. When Voldemort's curse had failed to kill Harry all those years before, a fragment of the Dark Lord's own shattered soul had lodged itself within the living boy. Harry himself was, in a sense that no one had ever intended, the last accidental vessel of Voldemort's soul. And as long as Harry lived, Voldemort could not fully die. The meaning of this settled over the 17-year-old boy slowly, like snow settling on a windowsill. If Voldemort was to end, then Harry would have to walk to him willingly and let the curse come, and offer no defense at all. And so, while the battle paused and the defenders of the castle carried their wounded into the great hall, Harry made the longest walk of his young life. He moved unseen beneath his father's old cloak, down the stone steps and across the dark lawn, past the places where he had learned to fly and laughed with his friends, toward the black line of the trees. In his hand he held the small golden snitch that Dumbledore had left him, and when he pressed it to his lips and told it that he was about to die, it opened at last, revealing the cracked black stone that legend called the Resurrection Stone. He turned it over in his fingers, and the people he had loved and lost came back to walk beside him, not as ghosts and not quite as flesh, but as something in between, kind and unafraid. His mother and father were there, and his godfather Sirius and Remus Lupin, and their presence wrapped around him like a warm coat on a cold night. He asked them whether dying hurt, and they told him, in their fashion, that it was easier than falling asleep. They stayed with him, step after step, all the way through the trees, until the firelight of Voldemort's camp flickered ahead, and Harry let the stone slip from his fingers into the leaves. In the clearing, Voldemort stood among his followers, the great snake Nagini floating beside him in her enchanted protective sphere. He had announced that he would wait 1 hour for Harry Potter to give himself up, and the hour had nearly passed, and a thin doubt had begun to work at him, when the boy stepped out from between the trees and into the light of the fire. There were no speeches, and there was no duel. Harry did not raise his wand. He simply stood there, and Voldemort, who had spent half a century fleeing from death, lifted the Elder Wand and sent the killing curse across the clearing at the boy who had chosen to accept it. The green light filled Harry's vision, and the world folded shut around him, painless and complete, like a book closing at the end of a long day. What happened next has been described only once, and even then in words that struggled to hold it. Harry found himself in a great white space that his mind dressed in the shape of King's Cross Station, clean and empty and full of a mild, sourceless light. Dumbledore was there, or something wise and familiar that wore Dumbledore's face, and in that place, between places, the old headmaster explained what had truly occurred. The curse had not killed Harry. It had destroyed only the fragment of Voldemort's soul that had lived inside him all those years, burning away the last tether the Dark Lord had hidden in another living being without ever knowing it. Harry was free of him now, cleaner than he had been since the night in Godric's Hollow, and he was given a choice, the rarest choice of all. He could board a train and go on, or he could return to the forest and finish what remained. He chose to go back. In the clearing, something strange had happened at the same moment. Voldemort himself had collapsed when the curse struck, felled briefly by the destruction of his own soul fragment, though he understood none of it. When he rose again, shaken and furious at his own weakness, he would not approach the boy's body himself. He sent Narcissa Malfoy to examine it, and here, in one of the most delicate turns of the entire war, the fate of the wizarding world came to rest on a mother's love. Narcissa knelt over Harry, felt the heartbeat under his shirt, and knew at once that he was alive. She bent low, as if inspecting him, and asked him under her breath whether her son Draco was alive inside the castle. Harry breathed the faintest yes, and Narcissa Malfoy, wife of a Death Eater, sister of Bellatrix Lestrange, rose to her feet and announced to Voldemort that Harry Potter was dead. She lied to the most feared legilimens in the world, to his face, because the only thing she wanted from that night was to walk into the castle and find her son. Believing himself victorious at last, Voldemort marched on Hogwarts, with Harry's limp body carried in the arms of a weeping Hagrid. He paraded his triumph before the survivors gathered at the castle doors, announcing that their hero had been killed while trying to flee. And for a terrible moment, the defenders' grief hung over the courtyard like a low fog. But then a single figure stepped out of the crowd. Neville Longbottom, the boy who had spent 7 years being underestimated. The boy raised by his grandmother after his parents were lost to Bellatrix's cruelty, walked forward alone and told Voldemort, in front of everyone, that the battle was not over. Voldemort, amused, summoned the old sorting hat and forced it onto Neville's head, setting it alight, declaring that there would be no more houses and no more sorting. And in that moment, chaos broke across the grounds. Reinforcements arrived from the village, and Neville, burning hat and all, drew from its depths the sword of Godric Gryffindor, the same sword that had come to Harry in the Chamber of Secrets so many years before. With one clean stroke, he took off the head of the great snake Nagini. The last Horcrux was gone. For the first time since before Harry Potter was born, Lord Voldemort was fully mortal. A single soul in a single body, though he alone did not yet grasp what that meant. The battle surged back into the castle, and in the confusion, Harry slipped from Hagrid's arms and vanished beneath his cloak once more. The final movement of the war played out in the Great Hall itself, beneath the enchanted ceiling, where hundreds of witches and wizards fought in the light of the coming dawn. Bellatrix Lestrange fell there, defeated in a furious duel by Molly Weasley, a mother defending her daughter, and when Voldemort turned his rage on Molly, Harry threw off the cloak at last and revealed himself, alive, to a hall that erupted in disbelief and hope. The two of them circled one another in the sudden hush, alone in a wide ring of watchers, and Harry spoke to Voldemort, not as an enemy shouting across a battlefield, but almost as one man trying, at the very end, to reach another. He told him about Snape, whose loyalty had belonged to Dumbledore and to the memory of Lily Potter for nearly 20 years. He told him about remorse, offering the Dark Lord one last chance to feel something for what he had done, the only known way to reassemble a torn soul. And he told him about the Elder Wand. Voldemort believed he had made the wand his own by taking it from Dumbledore's tomb and by silencing Snape, whom he assumed to be its master. But the wand's allegiance had never passed to Snape at all. On the night of Dumbledore's death, it was Draco Malfoy who had disarmed the old headmaster atop the tower, and the wand, in its strange and ancient logic, had recognized Draco as its new master. And weeks before this final night, in the drawing room of Malfoy Manor, Harry had wrested Draco's own wand from his hand, and with that act, the allegiance of the Elder Wand had passed invisibly to Harry himself. The most powerful wand in existence, the prize Voldemort had hunted across Europe, had belonged to the boy standing across from him all along. As the first true light of morning broke through the tall windows of the Great Hall, the two spells met. Voldemort cast the killing curse, and Harry cast a simple, disarming charm. The same spell he had used all his life. The Elder Wand refused to destroy its own master. The green light rebounded upon the man who had cast it, and Tom Riddle's long flight from death ended in a single, unremarkable instant. There was no explosion, no darkness pouring from the sky. His body simply folded and fell, empty and light, like a coat slipping from a hook, and the wand he had killed to possess spun through the air into Harry's open hand. The witnesses who stood closest said afterward that he looked smaller in death than anyone had imagined he could. Not a Dark Lord at all, but only a man who had traded away every piece of himself and was left, at the end, with nothing to hold him upright. The sun rose fully over Hogwarts on the morning of May the 2nd, and the hall filled with a sound that was equal parts weeping and cheering, grief and release woven together so tightly that no one could have separated them. The dead were laid in rows and honored. The living crowded around Harry until he could hardly breathe. And somewhere in the wreckage of the morning, the ordinary world began, very slowly, to resume. The boy from the orphanage on the London street, the brilliant student, the handsome young man who had asked for a teaching post, the faceless terror who had renamed himself so that no one would ever again speak of Tom Riddle. All of those selves ended together in the great hall, in the light of an early summer dawn, surrounded by the school he had loved more than he had ever managed to love a single human being. Up next in Chapter 21, What Remained, we'll uncover how the wizarding world rebuilt itself in the quiet years that followed, and what became of the name that once could not be spoken. Chapter 21. What Remained. The sun rose over Hogwarts on the morning of the 2nd of May, 1998, exactly as it had risen over that castle for 1,000 years, indifferent to victory and defeat alike, spilling warm early light across broken stone and scorched grass, across the lake and the surrounding mountains and the long sloping lawns where, only hours before, the fate of the entire wizarding world had been decided. There is something worth pausing on in that image. The ordinary sunrise arriving at the end of an extraordinary night, because for the people who lived through that morning, the simple return of daylight felt like a promise the world had been withholding for years. The war that had shadowed an entire generation, that had reached backward through 5 decades to an orphanage in London and a boy named Tom Riddle, was finally, truly over, and the world was left to discover what remained. In the great hall, beneath an enchanted ceiling that now showed a clear and brightening sky, the survivors gathered in the strange first hours of peace. Grief and relief sat side by side at the long tables, woven together so tightly that no one could have separated one from the other. Families held each other and wept for the fallen, for Fred Weasley, for Remus Lupin and Nymphadora Tonks, for Colin Creevey, and for so many others whose names would be carved into memory and into stone in the months to come. And yet, threaded through all of that sorrow, there was also an unmistakable lightness in the air, a loosening of something that had been clenched for years, because for the first time in living memory, for many of the youngest people in that hall, no one was hunting them, no one was coming, and tomorrow belonged to them again. As for the man who had caused all of it, his ending was marked by a remarkable absence of grandeur. The body of Lord Voldemort, the most feared dark wizard of his age, was carried away from the hall and laid in a chamber apart from those he had killed. And what struck the people who saw it was how small it seemed, how entirely human. All the terror he had cultivated, the flight and the serpentine face and the legend of invincibility, had come down in the end to this, an ordinary mortal form, emptied of everything, undone not by some rival power of equal darkness, but by his own rebounding curse and his own lifelong refusal to understand the magic he had dismissed as beneath him. He had spent his whole existence trying to become more than human, and history would remember that he succeeded only in becoming less. The weeks and months that followed were a season of rebuilding, and it is a comfort to dwell on them, because they show how thoroughly life insists on continuing. Kingsley Shacklebolt, steady and deeply respected, took leadership of the Ministry of Magic and began the long work of repair, releasing the innocent from Azkaban, dismantling the cruel machinery of the fallen regime, and hunting down those followers who had fled rather than face what they had done. The Muggle-born witches and wizards who had spent a year in hiding came home, Shops reopened in Diagon Alley, floorboard by floorboard and window by window. Hogwarts itself was restored over the course of that summer, its towers rebuilt, its corridors cleared, its portraits rehung, so that when the 1st of September arrived, the Scarlet Steam Engine departed from King's Cross once again, carrying students back to a school that had refused, in the deepest sense, to fall. Something subtle and profound happened to language in those first months of peace, and it tells us more about the end of Voldemort than any monument could. For decades, most of the wizarding world had not dared to speak his name, wrapping it instead in careful phrases, "He who must not be named, you know who," as though the syllables themselves might summon him. Fear of a name, Dumbledore had always taught, only deepens fear of the thing itself. And now, in kitchens and classrooms and the corridors of the ministry, people began to say it aloud. Voldemort. At first they said it carefully, the way one tests ice before stepping onto a frozen pond, and then, more freely, and then, almost casually, until children born after the war would grow up saying the name with no more dread than they gave any other figure from their history books. The terror he had spent a lifetime constructing dissolved, one spoken word at a time, into something the world could finally hold at arm's length and examine. And when the world did examine him, what it found was not a dark god or an unstoppable force, but a cautionary tale. Historians traced the whole arc of it, from the orphanage where a lonely and gifted boy learned too early that he could hurt people, through the school records that showed a brilliant and charming prefect named Tom Riddle, through the diary and the ring and the locket and the cup and the diadem, the deliberate shattering of a soul in exchange for the illusion of permanence. They studied the years of exile in distant forests, the body he lost and the lesser body he reclaimed in a graveyard in Little Hangleton, the 2 wars he ignited, and the second chance at conquest that ended on the flagstones of the castle he had once called his only home. The more thoroughly his life was understood, the less magnificent it appeared. And the story that endured was not the legend he had written for himself, but the truth beneath it, that of a man who was offered remorse even at the very end, and could not reach for it. Because it is impossible to tell the ending of this story without holding its 2 orphans side by side. Tom Riddle and Harry Potter began in circumstances so similar that the resemblance unsettled even Harry himself. Both were raised without parents, unloved in the homes where they grew, marked as different before they could understand why. Both discovered magic as a doorway out of a narrow life, and both, on their first sight of Hogwarts, recognized it as the first real home they had ever known. They even shared blood of the same ancient line, and a connection deeper and stranger than either of them chose. And yet from that nearly identical beginning, they walked in opposite directions, and the difference between them was never power, for both had power in abundance. The difference was what each of them decided to do with fear. Riddle met the fear of death and the fear of being ordinary by closing his heart, by trusting no one, by treating love as a weakness to be exploited in others and eliminated in himself. Harry met the same fears and kept his heart open anyway, leaning on friendship, accepting help, grieving his losses instead of denying them. And, when the moment came, walking into the forbidden forest to lay down his life for the people he loved. It is, as Dumbledore had told him long before, our choices that show what we truly are, far more than our abilities, and the entire war, seen from a distance, resolves into the shape of those 2 sets of choices. Nothing illustrates that difference more clearly than what happened to the Elder Wand. Voldemort had murdered for it, opened a tomb for it, and bent the last year of his life around possessing it, believing that the most powerful wand in existence was the final piece of his invincibility. Harry, who ended the battle as its true master, held that same legendary object in his hand, with every right to keep it and every excuse to use it, and chose not to. He used it once to repair the holly and phoenix feather wand that had chosen him at 11 years old, the humble, faithful wand that felt like his own hand. And then he put the elder wand away, intending that its bloody history should end with him. Where one orphan had reached for ultimate power with both hands, the other set it down without regret. And in that single, unhurried decision lives the entire moral of this long story. There were other acts of repair in those years that deserve remembering. Harry stood before the world and told the truth about Severus Snape, the double agent, who had loved Lily Evans his whole life and protected her son from the shadows, so that the name of the most hated man of the war became, in time, one of its most honored. The fallen were mourned properly, with funerals and memorials and the unhurried telling of their stories. Teddy Lupin, orphaned by the final battle just as Harry had been orphaned by the First War, grew up surrounded by godparents and grandparents, and an entire community determined that his story would be different, and it was. And then the years simply passed, as years do, kindly and without incident, until we arrive at the image the story chooses for its farewell. 19 years after the battle, on a bright 1st of September, Harry Potter stood on platform 9 3/4 at King's Cross Station, no longer a hunted boy, but a husband and a father, watching the scarlet engine fill the platform with steam. Around him were Ginny and Ron and Hermione, their children weaving between the trolleys, and beside him stood his second son, a small, dark-haired boy named Albus Severus, named for 2 headmasters of Hogwarts, one of whom was a Slytherin and probably the bravest man Harry ever knew. The boy was worried about which house would claim him, and his father knelt and reassured him that the choice, in the end, would take his own wishes into account, for that had always been the deepest law of that castle. The train pulled away, the children waved from the windows, and the scar on Harry's forehead, which had burned with borrowed hatred for 17 years, had not pained him in all the 19 years since. All, at long last, was well. So what remained, in the end, of Lord Voldemort? Not his Horcruxes, which were destroyed one by one. Not his followers, who were scattered and judged. Not his fear, which faded from the world like mist from a morning lake. What remained was the lesson of him, held in the space between 2 lives. He believed that death was the worst thing that could happen to a person, and he was wrong. And the proof of it stood on that sunlit platform, surrounded by family. The worst thing is not dying. The worst thing is living without love, and that was the one fate Tom Riddle never managed to escape. Harry, who accepted death, was given his life back, filled beyond anything the boy in the cupboard could have imagined. Voldemort, who fled death down every dark road there was, lost everything worth keeping long before the end. The castle stands there yet, on its lake, beneath its mountains, its windows glowing in the evening. The story it kept is finished now, and it is a story that ends in peace, with the long night over and every debt of fear repaid by love. You can set it down here and rest. And so the whole of it lies behind us now. A rainy orphanage in London, and a boy named Tom who could make things happen. Wool's narrow beds, and its locked cupboard of stolen trophies. A visitor named Dumbledore, and a wardrobe set alight. The letter from Hogwarts, and the first sight of the castle across the Black Lake. The handsome prefect with the borrowed smile. The gaunt shack, and a ring turned on a dead man's hand. The heir of Slytherin, and a chamber opened beneath the school. A diary, a locket, a cup, a diadem, a snake, 7 fragments of one soul scattered like coins. the years behind the counter at Borgen and Burke's, the long exile in distant forests, less than spirit, less than shadow, a cauldron in a graveyard, and a body reclaimed at midnight. A prophecy, half heard. 2 wars, 1 name no one dared speak, 3 friends in a tent, a winter of searching, a castle that rose to fight, the forest walk at dawn, the rebounding curse, the fall of the last enemy. A wand laid down instead of kept, a platform full of steam 19 years later, and a father kneeling beside his son. From an orphanage in London to the Great Hall at dawn, this story has carried us through the longest night. If you have walked these pages with us, know that the castle will always be there, patient on its lake, to welcome you home. Good night. What did you think of this journey? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this changed your perspective or taught you something new, consider subscribing for more mind-expanding content. And if you know someone who would find this as fascinating as you did, share it with them. These are the kind of conversations that matter.